Test 1, 2. Check, check. 1, 2, 3. Testing. Test for closed captioning. 1, 2, 3. Check, check. 1, 2. University of North Georgia. Test for closed captioning.
No, sir.
Mic check, mic check. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Test, test, test. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Test. Okay.
Okay, good morning and welcome back to everybody who was here yesterday, and welcome to some of you who were not here yesterday. Appreciate you coming. Just a couple of little announcements here. We plan to send all the participants who registered through the registration system an evaluation form for the symposium. And so when you get that, instead of hitting the delete button, we'd really appreciate you filling out the feedback form so that we can make adjustments as we go along. So one of the adjustments we made last year we had these white chairs and it had these real thin pads. And supposedly they're only good for sitting on for 2 hours. And so the convocation center manager, the operations manager, went out and bought these 3-inch padded chairs that you're supposed to be able to sit on for 6 hours at a time. So anyway, that was one of the results of the feedback form that we got from last year's symposium. So we'd really appreciate your feedback. We do consider it, and we do make adjustments based on that. So thank you for that. Also, international cadets, we're still doing poster sessions during the breaks. And again, if you were unable to visit the poster sessions yesterday, I would highly encourage us to go out there and take a look at the posters that the cadets have and the research that the cadets have done for us. Like yesterday, there's coffee and juice and stuff over here in the hospitality room. And at this time, I'd like to welcome Dr. Wells back up here again. And after he gets done speaking, we're going to have one more, or a drawing for another book.
this won't last more than 60 seconds because I gave my remarks yesterday. Sergeant Major has me on the clock. You know, he's spent at least 2 tours with me trying to keep me honest, all right, and has failed miserably. Okay, so here's the deal. First off, for the international cadets, I will tell you that we have a saying in the Army, well, particularly in the infantry, and I don't know what you did last night after the social, but the deal is this. If you want to hoot with, anybody know what an owl is? You know what an owl is? Yeah. Anybody who wants to hoot with the owl as a soldier must be able to scream with the eagles in the morning. Okay? But you're all here, so you did. And that's a great thing. Listen, I think this symposium has been very, very beneficial. I would ask you, as we proceed through this last component of the symposium, to think about, again, what are the implications of AI with regard to how we train future officers. It's something I think all of our nations are interested in. We're certainly not perfect at that, but if you don't anticipate what's happening, you're going to be left behind. And when you get left behind in the military, it's a bad thing because other folks are going to dictate to you what you do and how you live, and that's not good. So anyway, that's all I have to say. Keith, let's get this drawing underway. And by the way, if you get a book, please read it, cadets.
Hello again, everyone. It's good to see you all. Good morning. Good morning. Okay. So the first book we have today is by Tony Pfaff, Resolving Ethical Challenges in an Era of Persistent Conflict. And once again, all of the books are by the guest speakers are available for purchase near that front table. Michelle Nati. Michelle. Thank you so much. I have to say, really is random, but I am very glad that so many of our international cadets are able to get these books. All right, and we will be doing one final drawing later today. Thank you, guys.
Okay, Dr. Meany, you're on.
So good morning again. It's my honor to introduce our next keynote speaker, Major General Charles Dunlap. He is U.S. Air Force retired, joined the Duke Law Faculty in July 2010, where he is a professor of the practice of law and executive director of the Center on Law, Ethics and National Security. He is a graduate of St. Joseph's University, B.A. History, Villanova University, J.D. Law, and is a distinguished graduate of the National War College. Dunlap's Air Force career spanned over 34 years in the Judge Advocate General Corps. His service included tours in the UK and Korea, and he deployed for operations in the Middle East and Africa. At Duke, he teaches national security law, the use of force in international law, the law of armed conflict, legal and policy issues of civil-military relations, and readings in the ethical issues of national security law. A prolific author and accomplished public speaker, Dunlap's commentary on a wide variety of national security topics has appeared in leading newspapers, academic journals, books, and other publications. His 2001 essay, written for Harvard University's Carr Center on Lawfare, a concept he defines as the use or misuse of law as a substitute for traditional military means to accomplish an operational objective, has been highly influential among military scholars and in the broader legal academy. Apropos to our conference in 1999, he wrote a monograph for the Army War College entitled Technology and the 21st Century Battlefield, Recomplicating Moral Life for the Statesman and the Soldier. And since that time, he's written and spoken about the legal and ethical implications of autonomous weaponry as well as operations in cyberspace. He does have a blog. It is called Lawfare. Law Fire. Welcome, General
There's
Dunlap.
actually a story to that, Eddie, but
Okay, great.
well, thank you very much. That was a very kind introduction, and I'm really pleased to be here. It's been a lot of fun, seen some old friends, met some new ones, and I am a lawyer. I'm going to try not to use any legal terms. I'm not a philosopher, but I did have a Jesuit education, so, you know, that means something, because I know words can mean something. And fortunately, we do have a cadet from South Africa. South Africa was one of the countries that I visited. One of the great things about military service is you really do see the world. But South Africa was one of my favorite countries. And I was always well treated there. Their judge advocates are very much like ours in the sense they do everything. But they took me out to dinner, and what's South Africa known for? It's wines. And and correct me if I get anything wrong here, cadet, but they have 12 official languages in South Africa, of which English is one. I picked up one of the bottles, and I looked at the label, and it was entirely in Afrikaans. And so all the South Africans were looking at me. I poured a little glass, and I started drinking it. And to be perfectly honest, it was awful. But I'm drinking this stuff. The South Africans are looking at me. And finally, one of the wives of the South African officers, she leans over to me and she says, "Sir, you do know you're drinking the salad dressing, don't you?" I said, "Of course I do. We Americans love that." Anyway, I'm going to go through a lot of things here super, super quickly. So if you don't see everything, you will have a chance to, look at the film later on. What are ethics? Do you have ethics in the world of autonomous weapons? Well, I hope we do. We talked a little bit, this was mentioned yesterday, the Defense Innovation Board has come up with some ideas and really guideposts, as opposed to true ethical principles, just some general things that they're looking at as to guide the development. And what you'll see here is that the devil is in the details. And I think Paul Scharr yesterday kind of made that point for us. How does law play a role? Well, historically, law has been, because law started in ethics, and especially in the law of armed conflict, and will continue, I think, for the rest of time. One of the perspectives, though, comes from Australia, which I thought was kind of interesting. This woman was talking in a civilian context, but what she said was, we already have enough laws. We don't need laws to help us in this journey. And in fact, more recently, Eric Schmidt said, let's not so much regulate AI at this point, because we really don't know what the potential is. And in any event, we have existing regulations. What he's arguing is, don't regulate what you don't really understand yet. That's a way of looking at the world. I'm going to come back to that later. Is just compliance with the law enough to fulfill your ethical requirements? This young man wrote this article a couple years ago, and when you think about it, law just sets the minimum standards. Ethics goes above that. But what we'll be grappling with a little bit later on is, whose ethics really are you talking about? There's lots of ethical constructs out there. Do they matter? I think Chuck Hagel, who did serve in Vietnam, was a soldier himself, former Secretary of Defense. He made the point that in a democracy, it's important to have ethical parameters and adhere to the law, because it's part of the trust that you have to have with the public. But let's ask ourselves, is it really important? Cadet, what do you think? Is trust really important? Why? Ma'am, is trust really important? Why? And as a practical military officer, why is that important? Yeah, And in this country, actually, let me go back here a little bit. In this country, it's important because we have an all-volunteer force. So people aren't going to join an organization which they think is unethical. Young people, especially millennials, are adhering to the kinds of principles that they want to be associated with. And right now, being a military officer is one of the most prestigious organizations that you can belong to. And in fact, just this last June, the military is the most trusted organization in American society by far. We can talk about whether that's really a good thing, to be that popular in democracy. That's a legitimate discussion. But more recently, I thought this poll was important because what it showed is that this part is the important part, because this shows that most people think that military officers, more than other professions, act ethically. So this is an important standard of keeping the compact between the military and the people. So I do think and most recently, and even more recently, we just had a poll come out that says that the military is the agency in American society that Americans trust most to confront our adversaries in all dimensions, actually. So what would be the consequences? But do ethics matter for warfighting? And have today's adversaries weaponized it? This always struck me when I read this book so many years ago, because people in democracies aren't going to support operations if they think their militaries are acting unethically. And that's back in 1994. But as we saw, beginning with the post 9/11 wars, we have adversaries who are deliberately trying to orchestrate situations which would present to the public a military acting unethically. And what was America's worst defeat since 9/11? Worst defeat. Think about it. No, I think the cadets need to. What do you think? Worst defeat. Actually, Abu Ghraib. No U.S. soldiers killed, but it had an effect on the support that we need in a democracy. Would it have made a difference if an AI had done those things to the detainees? I don't think so. And there are real operational impacts. General Petraeus made the observation that Abu Ghraib, and this is the situation where U.S. troops were abusing detainees. He says, I like the words he uses, non-biodegradable. The enemy will keep beating you with that like a stick. In other words, they will keep using that against you when you're trying to win the support of the people. And it actually matters to the troops. When I was assigned to our nuclear command, I wrote a law review article about how we did the legal review for nuclear weapons strikes. We actually review it under international law. And part of the reason I was allowed to do it was the commander at that time was concerned about, wanted to make sure that the troops would do what they were told in a crisis situation. And part of it is they need to know that what they're doing is legal and moral. And so that was one reason why we did that. This is the monograph. I don't think it's for sale, but I don't think anybody over here was born when this was written. But I wrote this, and I thought what I would do is I'd go back and take a look at what I wrote 20 years ago and see how, if at all, it would apply today with respect to artificial intelligence. One of the first things I talked about in my conclusions was the unpredictability of reactions to technology. I wasn't thinking of artificial intelligence at that time. I'm not sure it was invented, or at least as we understand it today. But what I was wondering is, at that time, how would adversaries react? Because the Soviet Union at that time said that they would react to high detect precision-guided munitions that were just appearing with nuclear weapons. And so I was concerned we needed to think about how is the enemy going to react to technology and artificial intelligence. And in this context, nuclear weapons are one of the things we need to think about, because there have been people who have been concerned about the integration of artificial intelligence into the command and control system of nuclear forces could have an effect on adversaries where they might think that they had to act in a different way. In other words, upsetting the traditional notions of deterrence. And in fact, there's been a guy who recently wrote an article that said that because of artificial intelligence and the speed in which an adversary could strike us, we needed to have a dead hand. Do you know what a dead hand is? A dead hand is an automatic system that will react even if you're not able to do it yourself. And he suggested that this dead hand would have to operate through artificial intelligence. General Shanahan kind of put a nix on that, because we're not ready to go to the point where deterrence would require the use of an automatic system to respond. But I do wonder in the future if an adversary's system got so sophisticated that the only way to ensure a response was through artificial intelligence. And if you didn't have that system, what would that do to deterrence? Another point I talked about, I was concerned about the commingling of civilian and military systems. And at the time, I was more concerned about how computer systems were just coming online. We were very dependent upon civilian systems, and how were we going to resolve degrading that capability in an enemy that was used so much by civilian systems. And I think today, to update that, the issue is that we depend upon civilian enterprises primarily for a lot of the development of artificial intelligence. And Secretary Esper recently remarked on that. The problem, of course, is, as you probably know, a lot of the tech companies don't want to work with the government because they raise ethical issues about working with the government. And the ironic part about it with Google is that Google works with China. They build an artificial intelligence center in China. Now, what they say is we're not working with the military because they're working with the government, as if there was a difference. There you have it. Bob Work, former Deputy Secretary of Defense, has talked about this a lot, and he takes the position that the military does act ethically, and that the policy right now is that commanders are going to retain control over the artificial intelligence system, at least as it comes to the application of force. And this is actually General Shanahan from the same article. He talks about, people think that we're in some back room building the Terminator. That's kind of the summary of what he's saying. But that's not doing. And they're talking about the narrow intelligence. That's a term of art, narrow artificial intelligence. That's kind of the thing that's being touted, and we'll talk about it a bit more. And he points out that properly used artificial intelligence can actually limit civilian casualties and so forth. But one of the things, take a look at this. Sergeant Major, I want your opinion on this. Here's Dunlap's view of the world. If you get a commander gets in a situation, Bob says that, we don't want the true artificial intelligence weapon that's going to go out and search for targets and so forth. No commander would want that. I disagree. I think if a commander's in an existential fight and he's losing or she's losing, and she has a reasonable belief that this weapon will strike the enemy with a reasonable understanding that it's not going to violate the law of war, she's going to use it, I think. She's going to have to use it or face defeat. Sergeant Major?
I absolutely agree. I think in situations I would have liked to have AI rather than soldiers and Marines going in.
Yeah, and even if it was going to do it on its own, you're told, hey, the thing is only going to go after the enemy. might make mistakes. Well, you know your soldiers might go after the enemy, but they also might make mistakes. So, of course,
Same problem with plane weapons. Napalm, you look at all the islands in the Pacific that we took out using planes. Now nobody wants us to use one.
but we could, actually. In fact, I've written a blog post, and everybody's going to subscribe to my blog, right? You're going to. Yeah, and but it's this world that we're living in because of communication technologies empowered by AI. And so again, they're talking, what the US is developing now is this narrow AI. And narrow AI means like you get I think there's some examples he uses as sniper, where it's just limited to certain things. In other words, it will shoot down a drone that is coming your way, period. It won't look for other types of targets. Narrow AI. You know, the problem with that is adversary, here's something to take with you. Every time you try to do something good, the adversary is going to war game it and figure out how he can turn it into something bad. So if you develop narrow AI, they're going to develop something that is just a little different so that the AI doesn't go after it. Can we count on civilians to work out these ethical issues? No. Google tried to have a board and they had to cancel it because an African American woman was on the board and she happened to be a conservative and there were protests from Google employees, so they disbanded the whole board. It's something that the military is going to have to do itself, and I'll talk about how we do that. Let me go back for a second. One of the things I was concerned about is how information 20 years ago, the advances could impact democracies and how governments run because of just the super empowered nature of it. And I think we've only seen that more. Had some discussion about deep fakes. And deep fakes are really aided by the development of artificial intelligence. And as you know, a deep fake is when you're looking at a video and it looks super accurate, you can't tell the difference, and in fact, experts are having a hard time telling the difference. But this image that they see can have an effect on the population, motivations within the military, without the military. And so the Pentagon is aware of this. They're working on it. So now you have the Pentagon involving itself in really domestic US politics with the idea that they're defending the system in a way that we haven't normally seen the military get involved. And we need to think, what are the long-term implications of that? I also think there's a good short point paper that the Congressional Research Service has put out recently where they raise what are the issues about deep fakes for Congress in the context of national security. And you can see some of the questions that they're asking. And I would suggest to you that these raise various legal and ethical issues. Looking just very quickly, so you can see some of the things here have great implications for a democracy when you have the armed forces as a matter of national security trying to make judgments as to what should or should not be involved on social media. That's an issue that we got to think through. It's a legal issue, it's an ethical issue. And here's the thing, everybody is all lathered up about deep fakes, but if you have the opportunity and you are a commander and you can create a deep fake that shows the adversary's president doing something that is going to erode his authority and his power in his country to degrade the ability of that country to attack you, are you going to do it? Are you going to do it? Suppose that the adversary's president is elected, but they're a hostile country to you. Are you going to do it? Is that a legal issue? Legally, you probably could. I don't know anything in international law that's going to bar that. But is it an ethical issue? Because then you're attacking the concept of democracy. On the other hand, what's the consequence of not doing it? This is another issue. And in Like War, the book that one of our speakers has, it raises similar issues. Farrah Baker is 16 years old, and she started a blog or a Twitter account. And what's interesting about this, she had so much impact on that conflict that they characterized her impact was akin to the most elite special forces unit. So if that's having that kind of battlefield effect, what do you do to her? You take her out? Your soldiers are getting killed because of what this person is doing. Well, legally, yeah, you can take her out, but she's 16 years old. And she's just exposing, suppose that she's exposing the truth, but it's adverse to your military mission. And how do you deal with that? These are the kinds of ethical issues that are going to be occasioned because AI is super empowering these kinds of techniques. So we have to think about that. Is she targetable? Militarization of space. 20 years ago, I was concerned about the militarization of space and how that technology was going to work out. And actually, artificial intelligence has a lot to do with it because we're going to be able to do things in space that we weren't able to do before. And it will enable us to go to places and conduct operations. Now, there are treaties that forbid the establishment of military bases on the moon or other terrestrial objects, but you can still conduct operations in space. And we can talk about it during the Q&A. There's arguments that say, no, you can, despite what the Outer Space Treaty says, actually establish a military base on a planet under certain circumstances. So what they're talking about is soft law. What does soft law mean? It means like countries get together, it's not a treaty, it's not binding, they decide that we are going to do things this way or that way. It's like a code of conduct. It's trying to establish a norm. And it's a good idea if you want to eventually get to a treaty that you start out with these voluntary norms. But the problem was, the problem with trying to restrain this is that you can't verify. It's almost impossible to verify whether something has a weapon in it or not when it's in outer space. It's hard enough to do here on Earth, but in outer space it's virtually impossible. And so what people will say is that so long as you're not able to verify, you're not going to have weapons, you're not going to be able to have a treaty. So should your country be involved in an agreement, a voluntary agreement not to militarize space? Maybe. But then you have to think, what is the enemy going to be doing? What is the adversary going to be doing? And where will you be? How dependent are you on space? I would suggest very dependent. Don't think your cell phone, your GPS, and so many other things are going to work. One of the things that I thought about, I was concerned that technology, especially precision-guided munitions and so forth, and this is something we've talked about on our loop a lot, does it lower the threshold of conflict? And people will tell you, a recent article came out that said, because lowering the threshold of conflict, they think, oh my God, everybody, they're going to be being involved in conflicts all the time. And the question is that going to make a world at war? If artificial intelligence can make it seem like it doesn't cost a lot of human life, that will then be in a time of continuous war. I would suggest to you maybe, but what I'm asking here, is that always bad? I mean, continuous conflict, yeah. But if we get involved in conflicts that we might not have gotten involved with, is that really bad? Because as this suggests, humanitarian interventions, countries that may not have enough interest to go to Rwanda or Darfur or something like that and risk their soldiers might be willing to do something about genocide or something else if it is conducted by an artificial intelligence system. And here's an example of it. It has to do with drones, but what this author talks about is, maybe maybe we can do something about these horrible things that are happening in other countries that our people don't want to use our soldiers for, but if we have another way of doing it. So we need to think through what are the implications of that, because generally we would think it'd be bad, but then there might be times when it is good to lower the threshold of being involved in conflict. It's talking a lot about organizational culture. There's things that are happening in the artificial intelligence world that will affect your organizational culture, because you will have people in your units in the future who may be different in the sense of they may be artificially supplemented, the human-computer interface. It may be that there's different ways of using artificial intelligence to determine what people are thinking. You can find on the web that China is developing something that they can just put on somebody's head, and they can control drones without even touching anything, just through, it's picking up on the electrical energy in the mind. And so we need to think through, what are the implications when we supplement a human being with artificial intelligence? In other words, we are going to get to the point where we'll be able to plug something into your head, and that will give you capabilities. You know, can you conscript soldiers and force them to have something put in their head? And then what happens when they finish their military service? You may not be able to bring them back to what they were. These are kinds of some of the issues that are being raised. Organizational culture. How much do you have to know about AI to be a legal and moral actor? Here's something that's in the cyber law manual, which, by the way, was developed in Eastern Europe. It's a NATO-sponsored. And what they talk about here is that commanders don't have to know everything about and they're talking cyber here, but I suggest it applies to artificial intelligence. They can rely on subordinates, but that's not an excuse not to know anything. And ultimately, they're going to have a reasonable knowledge of what the system does and what the risks are in using that system. And how much do they have to know about ethics? I would suggest, okay, sounds good, doesn't it? Whose ethics are they going to be? Because can you just pick out ethics? Well, in the US military, say you have an ethical objection to an order. Interesting, but not an excuse for not obeying an otherwise lawful order. Because remember, law represents the agreed upon baseline. So if it's illegal in the US military, even if you object to it on ethical grounds, you still have to obey the order. So that's why I'm a little worried about who is this ethicist that they're talking about hiring. And why is the law that? Why is the law in the why do you think we have it in the US that you have to obey an order if it's legal, even if you personally don't like it? Why do you think we have that?
I think that in Italy we have the same problem during the fascist period. You know that it's something horrible because if the law is not ethical, you have to obey this. It would be a great problem.
Yeah, you have to obey the law. You don't, in the US, you don't have to obey the law if it's illegal. But if you individually think it's unethical, you still have to obey it. Why? Because there's lots of ethical codes out there. Lots of people think different things. And you have to have a baseline that everybody has to observe. So in the AI area, the tech companies came up. Have you heard about this tech accord where all these companies agreed to this ethical standard? I wrote on this because, you know, the devil's in the details. What did they exactly say in that tech accord? This is what they said they would do. What's the problem with that? Yeah. In other words, if ISIS is using their technology to to capture young women and turn them into sex slaves, they're going to protect ISIS. They're going to protect that system. That is morally indefensible. And they act like they're, achieved the high ground. I think that's offensive. I think it's unethical in its own way, but that's the way, and I just suggest to you that there are other people. Michael Ignatieff, who some people know I think he's Prime Minister of Canada or something, he wrote a book that when I was in the Somalia operation, it had a real, I reflected upon it after, that came out after the Somalia operation because it's something I saw in Somalia. You know, different societies have different understandings of what is ethical behavior. And so when you're trying to come up with something like AI and you're looking around the globe, you're going to find that there are different interpretations. Interestingly enough, 20 years ago, two Chinese colonels wrote this book. I would suggest to you that two Chinese colonels don't write a book and don't give an interview to the Washington Post without the agreement of the Chinese government. This is how they looked at it. Now, today, we're finding China is suddenly interested in this, and the idea was that they are wanting to have some sort of framework, and they want to continue to develop AI weapons. Here's the danger. Here's the danger. There are adversaries out there, they want you to the world to collectively throw up its hands and say, well, there's no law out there, because they've done this in cyber. There's no law out there, ergo, they will never be in violation of the law. And they'll make it seem like they want to develop law, knowing that it's not really going to get there. The Russians have been opposed to this for a long time. Now suddenly they're a little bit changing their tune because this is what their story is. We'll see what their real motives are. Now in the US, we've always counted on the notion of reciprocity. In other words, if we obey the law, if we act ethically, we do it because we can have confidence that if we do it, then the enemy is going to treat us that way. I would suggest to you that maybe that's not so true in the current world, because we have situations where fighting adversaries who set fire to pilots and bury children alive and so forth. And so now we have what I call the collapse of the notion of reciprocity. You really can't say that straight-faced to the troops. And it is a ethical problem and a legal problem, as Joshua Faust has pointed out in this article, because we're fighting people where we have this asymmetry of values. But the reality is that the public still wants us to act in the right way. So one of the things that the US military has done in its Law of Armed Conflict manual, which by the way is on the web, they've added the idea of honor. Now there have been academics. This is one of the difference between academics and people who have done something, or served, or been in the field. That's what I'm struggling for. Because they ridicule this. They ridicule the notion that honor would make a difference to a soldier on a battlefield. It can make a huge difference. There are soldiers, for example, if there is a soldier who's left behind on the battlefield, they will go to huge expenditures of life and resources to get that soldier. And I remember during the Kosovo operation, remember the F-16 pilot was down? When you looked at the total mobilization of that effort, there were 28,000 troops that were mobilized to get that one pilot out of Serbia. And there were a lot of things that would have happened to Serbia if that pilot hadn't been rescued. But I think this is a way. We have to fight against what we've seen in the past. When people are under stress, they do things that you wish they never had done. That's why part of our training for this AI situation, we need to talk specifically with the young soldier, the 19-year-old that's going to be in that crucible of pressure, and help prepare him or her for that moment. We have got to talk through, hey, this machine might be coming after you. It doesn't mean that you're going to take it out on all the civilians there. You've got to discipline yourself. You have to build that mental muscle memory so that the troops will do the right thing. And people always wonder, well, how come for example, we would always court-martial people for barracks larceny. People say, Why are you court-martialing? You only stole $20. I'll tell you why. Because when you go on that deployment and you put all those big bags in a big pile, it's easy to steal. And if people don't understand that there are consequences, because I can tell you, and Sergeant Major, correct me on this, when you go on a deployment, people are scared, they're under stress. And if their cell phone gets stolen or something, they will begin to obsess on that because that's the way they're dealing with the stress. And so we have to have these ideas in place specifically shaped to the artificial intelligence. So one of the things that we have to do, I think, is talk openly about our idea of ethics, our idea of adherence to the law, even when it can't be rationalized in the traditional way, because we're going to be facing situations which are going to be terrifying, and we need to make sure that our troops react in the right way. So it's called virtue ethics, where you focus on the goodness of the ethical standard as opposed to some kind of rationalization of the ethical standard. So a couple quick, again, coming back to the risk of overregulation. Ethics, if you're looking for rules, another rule scheme, that's the law. Ethics is where you develop an idea of what you should be doing and still accomplish your mission. So we'll see this. And the reason I put this up here in closing is we need to be aware. It's easy to come up with a lot of rules. A lot of people want to come up with a lot of rules. But every time you come up with a rule, that can be constraining. And just because you're constrained doesn't mean good things will happen. I often think about this in terms of our drone strikes. People say, oh, well, if you don't do that drone strike, no civilians are going to be killed. No, that's not true. You don't do that drone strike, that guy's going to live to go on to kill a lot of other people and do it in a horrific way. So never think that not doing something, constraining yourself, is ipso facto going to be more lawful, more ethical, and so forth. And I call it the moral hazard of inaction. Talk about it a little bit and try to put it in that context. Yeah, if you don't act, if you say you're restraining yourself on all these moral and legal things, you can feel good about yourself. Doesn't mean it's going to be good for people who are most vulnerable. There is a place for So, what are we going to, we need to keep in mind one thing. There's physical courage, but suppose if AI eliminates the need for physical courage in the way we've historically. There's still moral courage. Does anybody know who Hugh Thompson is? My Lai massacre. He was the helicopter. There was a massacre that was by U.S. troops of Vietnamese civilians. He landed his he saw it happening. He landed his helicopter. He got in a confrontation with the troops. He threatened to kill them if they continued to kill the Vietnamese. He was ostracized by the Army for 20 years. They finally gave him the Soldier's Medal. But it's an example of moral courage. And Max Hastings, one of the great military historians, he makes this observation. Now, what's interesting about that? More common among women than among men, moral courage. Interesting. But in any event, I've tried to raise a bunch of issues. I know I haven't resolved a lot of things, but I hope I've given us something to think about, especially as we look forward to the panel, which I'm anxiously awaiting. Do we have time for a couple questions? Okay, I'm going to ask. Yeah, well, no, we have one over here. Ma'am, what's your question? You have a question in your mind. What is your question? I don't know. I was hoping you could answer that. I've looked at that for a while. Ma'am.
So I'm interested, you were talking about the Cook's project, that it's not helping, that Cook doesn't help America, but helps China. What do you think, is it because that Chinese become, their economic becomes bigger and bigger in the future? China has really big how to say, they actually had a big future in economics. So is the like financing side that's why Google is interested in China?
You're raising, I'm so glad you asked that question because that's the right question. What we're seeing with these tech companies that are so, into artificial intelligence, they are getting so big, they fancy themselves, they think of themselves as global entities, not with responsibility to the sovereign nation which they, are headquarters. They think that they have a responsibility to the whole world, kind of irrespective of what these different countries may be doing. Now, what Google will tell you, oh no, we're not going to sell them this, this technology like facial recognition that they can use to suppress dissidents in their country. Yeah, they will, because they're money driven. At the end of the day, it's money. Now, keep in mind, the free enterprise system is a wonderful system. It's the reason like America has such a powerful military. But when it's unconstrained and it doesn't shore itself with some sense of loyalty to a value set that's represented by democracy, it can get unshored. In my article where I go after the tech accord that the technology companies have agreed to, you know what I talked about? In this country, we can conscript people. We can draft people if we want. We can take over companies if we want during wartime. We did it in the First World War. We did it in the Second World War. And as we look to the future, if this artificial intelligence technology is so critical to success, to the survival of our nation, then we may have to conscript. In other words, draft Google, draft engineers, draft their company, and so forth, if you're going to survive. And people say, well, how can that be legal? Well, there's lots of legal bases. Is it moral? Of course it is, because if you value democracy and the things that your country stands for, then you'll have to do those things when you're faced with what we call an existential threat. Do we have time for one more? Well, I'm going to go with the student. Is that okay? One more student question, and then we'll finish up real quick.
So I have a question because I've done research on this before, and I was law students. The question I find is that in international court, you actually have to have someone to hold accountabilities when you attack other countries. So if AI are manned by themselves autonomously, there's no one holding accountabilities.
I've been asked that question before, and it's a good one. Here's my answer to it. If you're the person that turns that AI on, you're accountable. So that means if you turn that on, you better know what it's going to do, because you're going to be personally accountable. And if you're a head of state, your nation is going to be held personally accountable. So that's why people your age you might not know all the details of how an AI works, but you're going to have a general idea. And here's the problem. Learning systems, artificial intelligence systems that learn as they do things, that may change what they will end up ultimately doing. That's why the US is looking at this narrow AI where it can't learn beyond certain parameters. And that may be the way that you have to go in the future. But it's a good question, it's asked a lot, but there are a lot of people say, oh, AI, you can't have AI because nobody's accountable. Yeah, there's somebody accountable, somebody who turns it on. And then the responsibilities of that person. Real quick.
Yes, sir. Sir, keeping with the theme of the symposium here, in talking about ethics and developing an ethical mindset and values with cadets and then future officers, how do we get beyond the annual checklist of doing the ethics briefing or the pre-deployment ethics briefing, but how do you embed ethics in all that we do?
Here's what I suggest. You talk about these general principles, like the Defense Innovation Board, and then you assign cadets to dive into what's being done. In other words, get their fingers into the technology and the capabilities and the proposals. And then you have a session with them where you ask them to compare what's being done with these broad ethical principles. In other words, they need to get into the facts, because the problem with a lot of our ethics education, it's all platitudes. It's like, do the right thing. Okay, I got that. But Sergeant Major, maybe you'll agree with me. We all want to do the right thing, but when you're when that vehicle is heading towards your checkpoint, you can see that there's children in there. You can also see that it's large enough to have a pretty good size. What do? You want to do the right thing, but you need to have a good understanding of the facts, because sometimes people say hypothetically they know that certain kind of vehicles have been stolen, and ergo they're more likely to actually be the threat versus, so that's why the facts make a difference. But we spend too much time just lecturing cadets and students about these broad platitudes without getting into the specifics. Now, one last thing I will say, don't be drawn into writing a cookbook for people, because this is what, Sergeant Major, you probably saw this in ROE briefs. You'll have the lieutenant down there. He starts asking you 50 questions where he's changing the facts a little bit, and he's writing them all down because he wants a cookbook. He wants to imagine every possible scenario. Of course, in real combat, the first thing that happens will not be in that cookbook. So we have to get people to internalize the values and then be able to react to them. And I also think that we have to give them a rationale, because if you just say we do this because we're good people, that can be hard. We do it because if we don't do it that way, our other soldiers are endangered. Our mission is endangered, because they can understand that. And especially because we know the motivation in combat. We like to think they're fighting for these big values, and in a sense they are, but in that tactical execution, it's the soldier right there that they're fighting for. And stop me if I get anything wrong, Sergeant Major.
One more question.
Yes, sir. You spoke about reciprocity and law of war for these cadets mainly that haven't faced perhaps any of those types of situations. What would you suggest to them that they start thinking about learning, and more importantly, passing on to their soldiers, so when they get into those ambiguous situations, or where we're really trying to follow the law of war and ethics and so forth, and the people we're fighting absolutely don't care about it, how do you prevent you can't, but how do you work to prevent the Abu Ghrabs, the My Lais, the Marines that think it's okay to do things out in the West to a child?
Here's the way you prepare yourself. I recommend that you read a lot of the books that are written by our young lieutenants coming out of Afghanistan and Iraq, because then people like to say, oh, well, it's just reading. No, reading gives you an intellectual database, so you can see how other people, what they were confronted with and how they dealt with it successfully or not. And then with your soldiers, what I recommend is that this is 21st century. Sergeant Major may not agree. Well, I think you would. When you're giving your orders to your soldiers, when you can, always explain to them the why, and never be one of those lieutenants who says, well, higher headquarters is forcing us to do it, because that erodes you. But take the time to explain, this is why we're doing it, because when you get in combat and you're not able to do that, they're going to know, she has a reason that she asks us to do this thing. And so we trust her, because you build up that trust in garrison. The other thing I recommend, based on my experience, you are very strict with them on some little things, like their uniform, if they're late or whatever. You don't just, there's a way that you deal with this, but you have to be strict with them in garrison. Because, can I tell one war story? I know I'm running a little bit over. Okay, during the Somalia operation, I was attached to the Marine Corps. Keep in mind, Air Force guy, JAG officer, never been in the field. First, no training, first going into the field. Sergeant Major, I couldn't even get my helmet cover on until the first sergeant helped me. But here's what happened. It was really, really hot. I was kind of the executive officer for the Marine General. He goes in, he says, Dunlap, you need to go look at your mechanics. I went out and saw the mechanics, and what they had done with their uniform, because it was hot, they cut it off. And they cut off and I'm like, what is going on here? And so I asked the chiefs. The only time, I was in the military for almost 35 years. This is the only time I ever did this. I got the two chiefs. I said, Chiefs, what's going on here? And he said, well, he started doing, hey, you don't understand. I said, Chiefs, I understand. Bring yourself to attention. That's the only time I ever did that with an E9. I said, switch to receive only. Because what you're doing with these soldiers is you're letting them think, oh, it's hot out here. We need to change everything. And do you think a soldier who gets that mindset and it's reinforced by his chief, do you think he's going to run that checklist on that airplane the way he's supposed to do? Because he's going to start thinking, everything's different. I don't have to do everything because it's hot. And when they get into combat, they will know what they're supposed to do, but they'll think that things are different somehow. And you have to set the example. And I think it's hard because when you're there, you're going to have to be the person who keeps the morale up, who doesn't let them get down and doesn't let them think that the rules don't apply. That's what happened in Abu Ghraib. You know what that happened in Abu Ghraib? The officers, this is so un-Army-like. And I was in the Air Force, but I've never seen this with the Army. But it happened. The junior enlisted people were in the prison, supposedly guarding these detainees. They're getting attacked all the time, so they're scared. They figure maybe we can soften these guys up or whatever. But there was no senior NCOs who came around and checked with them on swing shift. There were no young officers came around. So they were like just treating the prisoners any way they wanted because they were scared and they were trying to deal with it. You have to be the person that reminds them that we need to do things the right way, because if you don't, and they were calling each other by their first names, which we don't do in the U.S. military. And they start thinking rules don't apply. And one more example of this from World War II. There's a book by Richard Overy. It's called Why the West Won. When the German army went into Russia, Hitler issued the partisan order. And okay, you had the SS. Put the SS aside. This is the Wehrmacht, the regular German military, issued the partisan order. And what that partisan order said, you can kill any civilian you want because they're all partisans. They're all coming after you. And the German army had learned the traditional rules of war. But once you tell the soldiers something like that, then they throw out all their rules. How did it come back to bite them? When the German army was being pushed out of Russia, everybody talks about how disciplined they were. What they had to do was they had to start shooting their own troops. They had these, what we call summary court-martials, and they executed 15,000 of their own soldiers because the mindset of the soldiers was, okay, there are no rules, ergo, if there's no rules, then I don't have to stay at this frontline position. It changed their mindset. Always be thinking about what's the mindset of my soldier. And when you're dealing with young soldiers, you can't be saying, okay, this is the law here, this is ethical here, but it's not here. You can't mess with their minds like that because they're under extreme stress. You got to get it right and then stick to it. I mean, flexibility, sure, change circumstances once in a while, but not very often. So what you need to do is spend a lot of time preparing yourself for that moment. Do it through reading, decide what kind of person you're going to be, and then also build your brand, your reputation with your soldiers in peacetime, in garrison, because only in that way, when you get under the extreme stress of combat, will things happen the way you want to happen. Because otherwise, you know what's going to happen? If they don't see you as the leader, they're going to develop their own little leadership cadre. And there's a good article in Vanity Fair magazine about a unit in Iraq that's exactly what happened. They ended up committing war crimes because then they didn't know what the rules are. They were just doing what one guy told them. Sorry. Yeah.
Okay, we're out of time. Thank you, sir. And I'm going to make a presentation.
Okay.
I'm so glad you
I
were
have to
here
say
because
that
I felt better.
that last vignette reminded me of a great book, The Forgotten Soldier.
Absolutely.
Which talks about
must read Forgotten Soldier. It's about a German soldier on the Eastern Front, and I would recommend One Bullet Away that's a young American officer who served in Afghanistan and Iraq, and why he left the service. You know why he left the service? Nate Fick, this is. He said he could not continue to kill the thing that he loved the most. Very, very poignant.
Now, sir, you have a mission. All the books you've mentioned, that list is due to her because we do have a reading list that we recommend for cadets.
I'd be glad to do that. And believe me, the colonel is she stays on you. She stayed on me on this conference.
That's a fact. But also Candace's list as well. Okay. Sir, we have something for you. And you've seen this already, I think. Each one is personalized, by the way.
Oh, okay.
Thank you very much. But we hope you'll find a place for this in your office at Duke. And we greatly appreciate you being here. And I think one of the special things for you, based on the conversation last night, was all the international cadets.
I could not have been more impressed. And you know what I liked about you guys? I saw that you were having some fun. Because in this profession, when people you meet on this, you might meet them on a battlefield somewhere. And the fact that you know them a little bit, that is going to make a huge difference of getting things done under extreme stress. And so my recommendation, get everybody's email and stay in touch. That's important. It's more important than you can begin to imagine.
Sir, thank you very much
Thank
for your
you.
service, and thank you for coming.
Appreciate
Look
it.
out, you'll probably be invited back.
Okay, I've got 5 till 10. Let's reconvene at 5 after in 10 minutes, okay? So you can get up and take a break for 10 minutes.
Do we have, I think, just about everybody? Bryson, you need to get in here for this one. I guarantee. He's our cyber guru. He didn't hear me. He's trying to get some coffee. Okay, it's my pleasure to introduce Emerson T. Brooking. He's a resident fellow of the Digital Forensic Research Lab of the Atlantic Council and co-author of Like War. If you haven't read this book, you should. Like War, the Weaponization of Social Media. Now, I didn't really know too much about this guy, and I still don't know a whole lot. But I will tell you, after reading the book, you know, when you read a book, sometimes it's beneficial to read all of it, and that means the acknowledgments. In the back, I found out that he is, I think, from North Georgia, around Habersham County or someplace like that. And I said, perfect pick to come for this particular symposium. And he graciously agreed to come. Most recently, he was a research fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, the youngest researcher in a generation to receive such an appointment. He has served as an advisor on information warfare to the National Security Council, Joint Staff, the U.S. intelligence community, and his writing has been published in Foreign Affairs, Wired. Where's Bryson? Do you read that? That's what I thought. Rolling Stone, among others. Brooking was recently named to the Forbes 30 Under 30. He holds a BA in Political Science and Classical Studies from the University of Pennsylvania, and help me give him a warm North Georgia welcome.
I'm honored to be here. I'd like to start in June 2014. In June 2014, the Islamic State, which had emerged out of the Syrian civil war, from a new generation of rebel fighters, as well as the remnants of AQI, poured over from Syria into northern Iraq. They invaded. Now, the weapons they used weren't that much different from guerrilla groups past. It was about 1,500 guys in mostly Toyota pickup trucks with secondhand AKs. But they took a novel approach to this invasion, because typically if you're going into another country, launching some sort of paramilitary operation, you want to keep it a secret. But these guys wanted everyone to know about it. They had their own hashtag, All Eyes on ISIS. They had Twitter bots in a smartphone app, which amplified their propaganda across Arabic-speaking Twitter until it was the top trending subject for days. Everyone knew that ISIS was coming, and they were extremely good at doctoring propaganda, at basically making themselves look as indomitable and foreboding as possible. And so there was a contagion of fear which spread as they were advancing. In their sights was the city of Mosul, population about 1.5 million, at least on paper, defended by 60,000 Iraqi soldiers, as well as numerous Iraqi police who had been trained by the U.S. forces and still retained large amounts of U.S. equipment. But it wasn't enough. The fear of these ISIS forces spread like a virus through these communities. Not that many folks had access to a smartphone, but that in some ways it made the situation worse, because even if you weren't online, if you have a neighbor who's seen things, then they spread it by word of mouth. There's no way to check it, and it seemed like nothing could stop the ISIS forces. The defending Iraqi military disintegrated. The police fled, and then 500,000 civilians fled soon thereafter. When ISIS came into Mosul, they were essentially unopposed. They released militant prisoners that had been locked up. They increased the size of their forces significantly, and they seized this U.S. military arsenal. And all of a sudden, all of the propaganda they'd been spreading about how unstoppable they were, it started to seem a bit more like reality, and their propaganda output significantly increased. It was testament to the danger that ISIS posed that the Iraqi government could do nothing directly to stop these ISIS propaganda broadcasts, but instead, one of the first actions they took was to cut internet access for Iraqi citizens, to try to basically lock down Baghdad and stop civilians from having access to this propaganda, both to stop the contagion of fear and to try to forestall inspired terror attacks in Baghdad and elsewhere. And it was at this point that President Obama, after having made clear that our time in Iraq was over, began to initiate limited airstrikes against the Islamic State. ISIS kept growing stronger. In August 2014, they executed James Foley, an American journalist who'd been held for some years, who'd been captured earlier in the Syrian civil war. But they did it in a staged video. They actually shot it 8 or 9 times before they got it right, where they had the colors just right. They had multiple camera angles. The original was high definition. And when they cut this video, they called it a message to America, and they laid a Twitter and social media amplification network in advance to ensure that it would go as viral as possible. And it did. When this video was released, it was like a gunshot across the global information environment. This image graced front-page news everywhere. And that contagion of fear, which had hit Mosul a few months earlier, was now felt internationally, even though at this point the ISIS-inspired terror attacks abroad had not yet started, and in fact, no American citizens had been killed at home by this group. This was a singular terrorist killing, but it completely changed U.S. strategic calculus regarding the dangers that ISIS posed, and President Obama, who'd made absolutely clear that these limited airstrikes would not proceed into Syria, expanded these airstrikes into Syria. And the statistic that stands out to me most through all this is in September 2014, more Americans, according to a Pew poll, more Americans were scared of an imminent terror attack than had been in October 2001. Again, nothing had happened at home, but that fear was palpable and widely spread. And ISIS isn't alone. We've seen conflicts between Israel and Hamas extend online. We've seen increasing Russian utilization of social media propaganda. We've seen dozens of national militaries jumping into this space. And for myself and my co-author, this seemed like a field worth studying. I got interested in this issue back in 2012, shortly after I graduated school. I grew up here because you couldn't go anywhere until you could drive. I grew up on the internet. I was conversant with internet culture, but my interest and focus was on U.S. defense policy. It seemed clear to me that this social media, internet stuff, which was increasingly driving international politics, would affect conflict in turn. I looked around for all the smart folks who were writing on it, but a lot of people didn't seem to have caught on yet. So I jumped into this field, and that's how I've arrived at this point today. I want to start by discussing how we got here. And I want to start by talking about this phenomenon Dr. Singer and I call like war. And broadly, it's a contest of psychological and algorithmic manipulation fought through competing viral events. Well, what does that mean? To break it down, a competing viral event is just any piece of content you share online, any status update, any image. And it's all competing for this most scarce and finite resource, attention. And it's all competing in the same ecosystem. Terrorist or military propaganda is competing with a wedding photo or a status update from an old friend. All of these things now exist in that singular information environment. And how do you measure attention? Well, you measure it through likes, you measure it through page views, you measure it through emojis. So if you're thinking about this from a conflict and military perspective, you are competing for those same likes as everybody else. And this has fascinating political and military implications. If you think back to the Clausewitzian maxim, conflict, war, is a continuation of politics by other means. That just means that when you've exhausted diplomatic and economic recourse, you turn to force in order to realize your political objective. But you're always trying to achieve a specific military objective, and you have to do so by neutralizing your adversary's center of gravity. And when Clausewitz was writing in the 19th century, center of gravity just meant the opposing army. In Napoleonic times, if you take out your adversary's means to project force, the war is pretty much over. You can impose your political will on the enemy. After the 1920s, military theorists thought increasingly about air power and means of circumventing the adversary's army, and instead targeting civilian population and civilian industry and industrial capacity. The thinking being, if you neutralize those, that was the new center of gravity. Then you could realize your objective. There was another line of thinking that was emerging during this time, that maybe through a process of psychological dislocation, you could alter the perceptions of the civilian and military that you were fighting, that you could somehow change or eliminate the enemy's political will without ever having to fire a shot. This is broadly information warfare and propaganda. But for a long time, the thinking didn't line up with what was actually possible. During World War II, the Nazis hired a few thousand full-time shortwave radio operators. They were broadcasting some 50 or 60 hours of original content every day to try to win this global radio war. They even took the time, and there are a lot of things going on, but they took the time to track down a few native Gaelic speakers, who they tasked with doing a few hours of original broadcasting each day to Ireland. The intent being to reach a few Irish ultranationalists and open up a new front against the United Kingdom, Great Britain. However, even if you were persuaded by these broadcasts, you had to have a radio, you had to be tuned in at the right time, you couldn't record the broadcast and listen to it later, and you had to bind together with other people who felt like you did. Those were a lot of steps, and it couldn't really come together. Slightly more recent example, over the course of the Vietnam War, we dropped something like 5 tons of propaganda leaflets over North Vietnam, trying to help force a political settlement with the North Vietnamese government. These leaflets were extremely popular in Vietnam because it was the highest grade toilet paper you could get over the course of the conflict, but it had very little other political effect. But, as you might guess where I'm going, things are a lot different now. And the big term to remember here is disintermediation. And this is a term that communication scholars and internet theorists threw about a lot in the 90s, as they were thinking about the future effects the internet might have on society and on political organization. Disintermediation means taking out the middleman, taking out that thing that lies between a service provider and a consumer. In the context of retail, think about how Amazon has largely supplanted the need for big box stores, how Lyft and Uber have changed the game when it comes to taxi licensing systems, or how dating services like Tinder have fundamentally changed how you meet partners for millennials and Gen Z. But disintermediation has always promised its greatest effects with regard to the media and how we consumed information. Because traditionally, you had big broadcast companies. You had radio and television. And then you had a series of what were essentially gatekeepers, which were editors and reporters who'd figure out the stories that were most salient for the public, then package them and make them available to people. The thinking, as folks were considering the implications of the internet, was that all of a sudden, everyone would be an information producer, and anyone could consume anything that anyone else produced. You'd eliminate the need for these gatekeepers. You would democratize the information environment. And these guys all thought that you'd have some sort of noble free market for information, where the stuff that was best and did the most objective good for society would invariably rise to the top of the pile. As we know today, though, that's absolutely not the case. It's the most salacious content that rises to the top. It's the stuff that stokes outrage. And, in fact, nothing at all says that this content has to be true. It's useful to survey what this information environment looks like. Because when we talk about an entity like Facebook, there's several orders of magnitude difference between it and previous media. Facebook right now has about 2.4 billion active users. That makes it substantially larger than the biggest country in the world. Facebook's actually the second largest continent in the world after the Asia Pacific. And when we also think about this information environment and this new information battlefield, we should understand that there are no neutral rules that govern it. There's not the force of gravity or weather or other environmental concerns which are neutral. Instead, this environment is governed by algorithms. They're written by a handful of engineers based primarily in Silicon Valley. And it's manipulation of those algorithms which then becomes a major priority of anyone who's trying to compete in this information environment. And we have a lot of people, a lot of national governments and militaries who now have decided they have to compete in this information environment. There are some 30 verified national militaries who've launched information manipulation apparatuses for the purpose of infiltrating and altering social media conversation. Altogether, when you factor in third parties and political parties, there are some 70 nations where this is occurring. And that's just the ones we know about. And the US and a few other countries have actually been in this sphere for a while. But I think it's testament to how crucial this focus is becoming that in late 2017, Secretary of Defense Mattis elevated information is the newest joint function. So I want to shift gears a bit and talk about how the social media environment changes military intelligence. And I want to start back in World War II. If you think about Operation Overlord, but more specifically, if you think about the preparation for Overlord, there were, at the height of our preparations, some 40,000 tons, it might be 40 million tons, it was a lot of material transiting to the British Isles each month. We had some 2 million Allied soldiers who were in theater getting ready to invade. The Germans obviously knew a landing was coming, but through a bit of subterfuge and a bit of luck, the Germans were caught unaware and truly did not know where we were going to show up until the first Allied soldiers stormed Omaha and Utah beaches. I want to contrast that with a more recent military operation, probably one of the most secretive in modern U.S. history. This was Operation Neptune Spear, the mission to get Osama bin Laden in 2011. Now, we had our best and most silent, SEAL Team 6. We had 2 specially equipped Black Hawk helicopters who flew low into Abbottabad, Pakistan. There were, out of the giant U.S. national security bureaucracy, there might have been 100 people who understood the full extent of the operation and mission and what was involved. The sole video link everyone thought to this operation was being transmitted to the Situation Room with that iconic photo with President Obama and his team watching the operation unfold. But in fact, there was another corroborating source for this operation. There was a Pakistani IT consultant who was staying up late at night. He was crashing on a project. He heard helicopters overhead, and he did what a lot of us would do. He took to Twitter to complain about it. And the record he left quickly became corroborating evidence for reporters. The moment that President Obama announced that bin Laden was dead, reporters figured out the city that had been hit, and they figured out a lot of details that the U.S. government wasn't necessarily going to disclose to the public, all through these contemporaneous tweets. What's interesting is that this guy, Sohaib Athar, was watching Obama's broadcast too. It's now mid-afternoon the next day in Abbottabad, Pakistan, and he tweets, "Uh-oh, I'm the guy who live-tweeted the mission to get Osama bin Laden." and Western journalists immediately go to his house. To this day, he's accused of being alternately an agent of Al-Qaeda, of Mossad, of the Pakistani intelligence forces. It doesn't matter. There's just this shock and surprise that he had this unusual window into this highly secretive event. But that's actually just the way things work these days. And when this happened in 2011, Pakistan had an internet penetration rate of only about 4%. So only about 4% of people use the internet. Now it's up to 40%. And I want to highlight an even more recent example, which was conducted by my own digital forensic research lab. Earlier this year, there was an escalation, significant escalation between India and Pakistan. It looked like they might turn to a more general conflict. There had been a terror attack conducted by JEM militants based out of disputed territory in Kashmir, likely supported by the Pakistanis, who had killed 24 Indian soldiers. India retaliates with airstrikes over the line of control that's traditionally divided Kashmir. It was a big event. There was a lot of confusion and a lot of disinformation flying around. But India, which was also in the middle of a general election, claims that they've struck a JEM militant compound, and the initial estimates are that they've killed 500 militants. Well, this seemed a little high, and there wasn't really that much information to go on, so I had just joined my organization. And the guy who was investigating this was one 24-year-old Danish dude who just liked military hardware but had no clue about Indian-Pakistan dynamics. He just knew how to use the internet to pick out pieces of information. And he definitely did. There were a few videos of the village that had supposedly been struck by the Indian airstrikes. He was able to take bits of those footage and images, clarify them a little bit to try to look for distinguishing landmarks, then line those up with Google Maps to geolocate the purported JEM militant compound. Of course, Google Maps doesn't update every day, but a private satellite provider does. So for like $300, we purchased before and after satellite imagery of the area, did some very rudimentary battle damage assessment, and although we couldn't be 100%, it was still a little bit foggy, it didn't look like an area that had held 500 militants who'd all been killed. And we put out our findings. Well, there are a lot of Indians online, and there are a lot of Indian ultranationalists. So we very quickly became ourselves a target in this information war, which invariably became part of the Indian general election. And there were actually walkbacks on the part of the Indian military who said, actually, we're not the ones who said it. It was the civilian government who said it. There were disputes within the BJP ruling party in India. It quickly became an electoral issue. The Indian government pushed back. They leaked supposed video of the strike to Indian media. That video turned out to be taken from a video game. Then, purportedly, Indian military had the clarifying satellite imagery, just wasn't going to share it. And that's basically where they left it. But more recently, they've taken a new line of attack and actually are targeting these open source intelligence analysts online through Twitter, trying to shut them up by saying that they're a threat to national security. So not only is there's this revolution in military intelligence, but it's now fusing with general information warfare. Now I want to talk about what these information warfare, what these campaigns look like in the open. And I want to start with a non-military example. This was the Fire Festival. I would highly recommend, if you haven't, check out a documentary on Netflix or Hulu about it. But in short, two tech guys who had no experience in the music industry, no experience running a festival, decided to throw the biggest and most ambitious one in history. They wanted it to be different, so they chose a island in the Bahamas that did not have electricity or running water. Not a great start. They also decided to start ticket pricing around $5,000, which is a bit high for a music festival. Also not a great start. One could reasonably be skeptical if they were going to pull it off. But these guys also intuitively understood the modern information environment. So with their seed money, they actually put no effort into planning the festival. Instead, they put together the coolest trailer that you'd ever seen for a music festival. They spend like $3 million on this 1-minute trailer. They fly in Instagram models from around the country to party on a different Bahamian island. They pay Kylie Jenner $250,000 to do one sponsored Instagram post regarding the festival. But that Instagram post goes out to 100 million ardent followers. So quite quickly, the Fire Festival becomes the hottest festival ever. Everyone wants a ticket, they sell out, they oversell. And then there's a ton of people who show up to Florida and fly to the Bahamas expecting the experience of a lifetime, expecting this. Problem is, though, we have some logisticians in the room. Planning is everything. Just because you're selling a beautiful image doesn't mean it's going to come to fruition unless you put in a lot of hard work, which they didn't do. These guys showed up to what was to FEMA humanitarian tents, what was literally a humanitarian disaster. The Bahamian government helped evacuate the Americans, and the whole thing collapsed. But lest you think that this was a shock, there were people on the ground in the Bahamas who were capturing this evidence the whole time, saying, "Don't come here, this is not going to come together." But this was a handful of interested citizens who had a Twitter following of maybe a few hundred people. They were up against Kylie Jenner. They had no chance at all. So this was another information battle. I want to start shifting us more toward conflict and talk briefly about gang violence and its utilization of social media. Because many of the things we see now in global warfare were you could see the first hints of regarding gang organization. When you think about gangs and criminals, they're basically a different form of political organization, inhabited by almost exclusively testosterone-filled young men who were trying to front and trying to show off, who were early conversant users of social media technologies and integrated them seamlessly into gang culture. The man pictured here was Shaquan Thomas. He grew up on the south side of Chicago. He was a very talented musician and a YouTube rapper, but he was also a member of a local gang franchise of the Gangster Disciples, and he wanted everyone to know it. He incorporated gang life and symbolism into his music, and he became a major target of other gangs for assassination. His rivals tried to kill him. They missed the first time. The second time they also missed, but they killed a bystander. Now, if you've just survived 2 attempts on your life, you might lay low a while, but for Thomas, he saw this as content, which he built into his songs, which got more popular than ever. So to him, this life and death situation was also building his brand, and so he kept going. They got him on the 3rd attempt, and Thomas died in 2015. But unfortunately, his story didn't end there, because a week later, in a totally different part of Chicago, miles away, with different gang dynamics, one high schooler shot and killed another one in an argument over his memory because they had disrespected him. And over time, he's become something of an icon with that microscopic bit of gang culture. And I really like this quote by 2 criminologists who were studying social media use over a decade in Chicago and elsewhere. They say that the street is no longer limited to the perceptual horizon of the person walking down it. What that means is if someone fronts on you, if someone disrespects you on social media, but if that internet personality is so intrinsic to your brand and existence, it's no different than if someone is disrespecting you in real life. And this also has implications for international diplomacy. If you think back to January 2018, we saw a brief but significant escalation with North Korea. President Trump, via Twitter, initiated what was probably the most explicit threat of U.S. nuclear use in several decades. But just think about the dynamics at play here. President Trump did not need to navigate a giant State Department bureaucracy who would whittle down what he was trying to say and basically repackage it in diplomatic speech. Instead, he could pick up his smartphone and type out exactly what he was thinking. It would reach a rival world leader who would then respond in kind, because Kim Jong-un is very good at these same sorts of bombastic declarations. as we think about the ways that social media changes these narrative conflicts, we should understand that in the future, even after President Trump, we're probably going to live in a world where world leaders communicate directly, where they are tempted and party to all the same passions and anger and escalation as anyone who uses these platforms, and that international politics will change accordingly. I'm unfortunately going to have to speed this up, but another conflict example very recently conducted by my lab is just examining the Turkish invasion of northeastern Syria and their attacks and fighting against the YPG. We see here just a demonstration of a Turkish information campaign which was only intended to seize just a few hours of Twitter traffic, but to start to repackage and represent the YPG Kurdish fighters as terrorists. We should understand that every national military is using this. This is an intrinsic part of warfare moving forward. Now, I want to talk very briefly about these conflicts that we can't see. And the best entry point to that is the Russia stuff. Because when you're doing this social media manipulation, it doesn't have to be a clear two-sided narrative contest. You can also pretend to be someone else. You can infiltrate these conversations and work through the shadows. And my best way to approach this is to provide a little bit of context regarding how Russia saw these information operations against the US. The starting point is the 2009 Green Revolution in Iran, where a small group of pro-democracy protesters became a much larger group, organizing via Twitter and Facebook. For the West, this was a beautiful moment of social media's dream realized, of helping spread pro-democracy forces abroad. For Iran, for Russia, for China, for numerous other less open societies, this was an information attack by the West against a political system. And many nations began to think about how to weaponize this space accordingly. Here we have an excerpt of the 2009 Russian National Security Strategy. Events kept moving. There was the Arab Spring in 2011, but at the tail end of the Arab Spring, President Putin saw the most significant protests against his rule since he'd come to power. And this too seemed to be fomented clearly by the United States and NATO in an attempt to change the Russian government. More reflection, more concern. And then, Euromaidan in 2014, the overthrow of a Russia-friendly oligarch in Ukraine replaced with a much more pro-Western democratic society. And this for Russia was essentially the last straw. They began to invest heavily in information manipulation capabilities. But the important thing to emphasize here is that, at least through Russian doctrine, Russian military thinking and journal articles, this investment was seen as a preventive or preemptive measure to essentially use information to defang and neutralize a more powerful conventional adversary, to try to forestall military conflict by using information and political infiltration to paralyze a rival. So I get asked a lot, is Putin, are the Russians Republicans? What's the deal here? And no, it was just thinking about the most effective way to hold NATO and U.S. foreign policy in stasis. They just happened to choose one person over the other. Very briefly, how this stuff worked. A few statistics that just stand out to me. Over the course of this relatively minuscule investment, it cost them maybe $10 million and 100 full-time staff working on this stuff. They managed to at least briefly reach 140 million Americans on Twitter, more than the voting population, or on Facebook. On Twitter, they ran Twitter accounts which were shared and rebroadcast by a number of individuals who are now administration officials who thought that this was representative of an unofficial GOP party. In some cases, Russians actually orchestrated protests and counter-protests in the United States. They're running both sides of Facebook pages, one in support of Texas honor and potential secession, the other in support of Islamic cultural values. They get these two groups of protesters to meet up across the street from each other. trying, it seems, to incite some violence between them. And the folks doing this weren't hard-boiled Russian intelligence agents. They were humanities majors who couldn't get jobs. They were kids who'd grown up in Western culture, steeped in it. A lot of them loved the U.S., conversant in English, but it was philosophy and political science grads, and nowhere else was hiring. What they were doing was essentially a different form of marketing, and it's going to become prolific in political campaigns in the years to come. How does this look like in practice? Very briefly, in 2016, a group of researchers were trying to map Twitter conversation regarding the Black Lives Matter movement and shooting incidents of unarmed black men by police officers. They divided a number of Twitter accounts in the left-leaning and right-leaning quadrants. And the closer you are to the center of one of these networks, basically the more of a true believer you are, the more you're only interacting with people who think and feel like you do. And over time, this sort of behavior leads to a gradual self-radicalization or polarization as these two groups move further and further apart. Well, in 2018, Twitter released a list of attributed Twitter accounts which have been operated by Russians and folks from the Russian trolls. They map it onto this network. And if you'll see, in roughly the center, in the most polarized part of each of these networks, is not American citizens, but instead outside actors who actually have no party to American political processes, but are just trying to pool and fragment society as much as possible. And the end goal of this, as I said, is not to defeat the United States in any definitive way, but rather to tie it down, to hold it in a place where it can't effectively use its own more conventional instruments of force. And I'll close by reflecting very briefly on how AI is going to change all of this. This is available now, Face App. You can play around with your own face. You can age it if you want to look like what you look like when you're older. And this is all deep fake. This is all very basic audiovisual manipulation. This is also a deep fake, but these are wholly generated faces by an algorithm. None of these people are real. And this is of great concern when you're talking about social media influence operations, because one of the primary ways we detect false personas online is by seeing where they stole their photo from. But very soon, that will no longer be a factor, and machines will be able to effectively masquerade as real people. But the stuff that has me the most worried, well, here's a video of that in action. This actually doesn't have me as worried, but it's a good illustration of a deep fake, produced by Xinhua, which is the Chinese public-facing broadcaster, which was basically a message to the West, where they recorded this actress, but her movements right now are spontaneous and machine-generated. She's not actually doing this. And if you could hear her, she has a pretty believable English language voice where she's delivering a script. That voice is also entirely machine-generated. It's just a glimpse of what will soon be the new reality. But what has me most worried is the stuff that looks a little bit less sexy, and this is textual generation. The idea that soon, in fact, this is a primary field of research now, machines will be able to read, consume massive amounts of text, and begin to understand basic context, and then write responses accordingly. What's pictured here is just a recent paper published by a group of Chinese computer scientists who tested a new AI on a ton of ESPN stories. And we see here their program, DeepCom, is just commenting on the story about the Rockets, that the Rockets are they're gonna do a good job in the next season. It's not crazy stuff, but it is another massive leap forward when you think about artificial intelligence and how it interacts with machines. And lastly, you can do this too. There was just a public release of a neural network that conducts textual generation. So what you see on the screen here, I just played around with the software for this presentation. What you see here is me posing a question to the machine in bold. Everything you see after is what a machine wrote. This is entirely AI generated. And this first one, it's basically an introduction to a student paper. It's not that great, but you can't really tell that a machine wrote it. I tried it again, and we see a very different strategy. This is kind of what students do if they're out of time and they're just trying to summarize a presentation. Again, not the most compelling stuff, but crazy to believe that a machine wrote it. I tried it one more time, and this is the one I liked the most, because it really reads like a dispatch from a conference. And what resonated with me was the last line that this AI decided to produce. The Army is in no way prepared to meet the challenges of the future of warfare. Their new course is a start. They still have a long way to go. And it seems to me like a new course is being set at this conference. And thank you very much for having me.
Okay, so we have time for some questions, and thank you for writing our after-action report. Questions? It's an amazing thing. From Bryson, this is some of the stuff that you work in your class.
So how do consumers, leaders, how do you discern what's real, what's not? What steps do you recommend so that, in the future they're reading a dispatch, or they're picking up some information from somewhere? What are the signs, the symbols, the triggers that will cause you to suspect that maybe this is not correct? And what do you do about it?
Well, I'll give you a short-term and a long-term answer. Short-term, I think that the cadets are the best equipped out of anyone in this room to deal with modern disinformation and information manipulation. Right after this became a big topic of public conversation, there was a big fear that it was going to be the next generation who are going to be overwhelmed by this stuff. But we have more studies now that show, unfortunately, it's folks over the age of 65 who are significantly more vulnerable to what they read online. That's because they're generally newer to these internet platforms and they haven't grown up with them in the same way. If you think about how younger people consume information, they're much more likely to do so in a horizontal fashion. Instead of digging deep into one website or news source, they often skim shallowly across a range of sources. If there's an individual claim, it just takes a quick Google to see if it's echoed elsewhere. And by doing that, you're basically doing a broad-based authentication across the whole information ecosystem. It's not foolproof, but that sort of just thinking and checking alternative sources helps you avoid a lot of this most obvious manipulation. But in the long term, especially this AI-generated stuff, I think it's going to be indistinguishable from the real thing. I don't think there's a way that us as human beings can make that distinction. The best we can do is develop AIs that detect trace elements of machine manipulation. Now, and that's a big focus of the social media companies now. That's where they're investing a lot of time. So I think we're going to see a future where there's going to be this photorealistic or entirely believable AI-generated material that's then detected and pushed back by another AI. So in essence, the future information battlefield is going to have two AIs, one on either side, each fighting a war that's essentially invisible to us.
Okay, I'm going to be up all night. So as someone who teaches an occasional course, we're already challenged with how to figure out plagiarism by students doing this, and Turnitin doesn't necessarily capture all of them. So what it sounded like you just talked about was we're now training students to be, in my profession, intel analysts, because the veracity of the information first has to be clarified and verified before they ever use it as a source. So at the university level, how would you suggest we attack that?
One of the best ways to encourage information literacy and deep thinking regarding veracity of sources is to put students in the seat of being a disinformation actor. Instead of, and we have some pedagogical studies on this now, instead of presenting students with a list of, recommended best practices, or even a list of rote facts, which tend to be mispresented, instead, the exercise can regard whatever content, but you put one student in charge of trying to deceive another student through a system of online tools. That one student is thinking how most creatively to effect the deception. The other student is on guard against being deceived, and it assesses the material they're accessing much more critically. And over time, by teaching that sort of adversarial relationship, I think you build a lot more thoughtfulness regarding how you approach the information environment. And I should say that adversarial training model is also how we train the AIs. The AIs that detect machine forgeries are paired with an AI that's producing them. So in this way, we would emulate the machines if we're trying to come up with a more effective course of instruction.
Sir, you mentioned about ISIS manipulation, and I have read about that young people from Raqqa that posted real pictures and real video. I think a good way to fight against this manipulation in closed area is to promote this kind of young people real posting on the Twitter, Facebook, and so on. What do you think?
Certainly. So after ISIS held Mosul, it was telling one of their first actions was to ban satellite dishes and internet access, because they were conversant and good at manipulating the online information environment, but they also understood that one of the greatest threats to their power was the production of counter-propaganda that might have presented them in a less good light. And in fact, there were a handful of extremely brave residents of Mosul who maintained Twitter accounts and online posting profiles for the duration of the occupation. And the material that they put out was invaluable for the broader coalition and other civil society actors outside of Iraq to begin to contest that narrative battlefield, which ISIS had initially dominated. So I do think one of the best things you can do when you're facing an adversary that's conversant with these tools but also has a closed information environment is to use resources to give access to the information environment to citizens within that area who might have a very different view of their occupier or their government but may not be empowered to speak freely.
Okay, that's it. Thank you very much. Fascinating presentation.
Thank you so much. You can't slip away either just yet. Excuse me for a second. It's good to have you back in North Georgia.
Happy to be here.
And we hope you'll come back for other appearances perhaps, because this topic is one that bears a heck of a lot more work and discussion. And it's been very insightful. I still can't believe when I got to the acknowledgments at the end that talked about you being from North Georgia, I said, we got to get that guy. But we have a small gift for you that you'll put in your office, we hope. And again, this is not digital, by the way. It's hard copy.
Yes.
But thank you so much for being here and helping us with this
Thank you.
discussion. So, whoops.
Thank you.
Okay, if we could have the next panel meet up front here in a minute. And then this is the last opportunity to hear the poster presentations from our international cadets. And so if you would make your way out there if you haven't done so already and do that. And let's take until 10 after. So right now it's 10:55. So we'll reconvene at 11:10. Does that sound good? Okay, thank you.
Well, welcome back. It's my honor now to introduce the next panel. The theme is Ethical Implications of AI on the Future Battlefield. And a special honor to introduce our moderator, Dr. Tony Pfaff. Dr. Pfaff is currently the Research Professor for Strategy, the Military Profession and Ethics at the Strategic Studies Institute, U.S. Army War College, Carlisle, Pennsylvania. He's also a Senior Non-Resident Fellow at the Atlantic Council. Dr. Pfaff has served on the National Security Council staff and the State Department Policy Planning staff, where he advised on cyber, regional military affairs, Middle East, and security sector assistance reform. Prior to taking the State Department position, he served as the Defense Attaché in Baghdad, the Chief of International Military Affairs for U.S. Army Central Command, and as the Defense Attaché in Kuwait. He served twice in Operation Iraqi Freedom, once as the Deputy J2 for a Joint Special Operations Task Force, and as the Senior Military Advisor for the Civilian Police Assistance Training Team. Dr. Pfaff has authored numerous articles on national security ethics, including on the acquisition of disruptive technologies. He has a bachelor's degree in philosophy and economics from Washington and Lee University, a master's degree in philosophy from Stanford University, a master's in national resource management from the Industrial College of the Armed Forces, and a doctorate in philosophy from Georgetown University. Dr. Pfaff.
Well, thanks to everybody for sticking around. We've had a great conference so far, and we hope to kind of end it on a high note. And so I'll get, knowing that we're between everyone and freedom, we'll get down to it. So it is my pleasure to introduce Lieutenant Colonel Chaplain Jacob Scott, who is a chaplain in the Oregon National Guard, as well as a pastor in the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. He started off his military career as a combat engineer and has seen combat on the ground in Iraq, and then he also deployed to Afghanistan as a chaplain. Probably not importantly, but relevant for our purposes, he's also a 2019 graduate of the U.S. Army War College. Well, oh wait, we don't have a mascot. You have to work on that. Where he did a strategic research project on the ethics of lethal autonomous weapon systems. And so you understand how, what kind of thing that is. That's a year-long investment where you spend, where he is able to take the expertise that he has and then dig into something of strategic importance to the Army with the resources available from the Army War College, as well as all the expertise that the professors there can connect him to. So I'm really looking forward to this, and on that cheerful note, you're on.
Well, thank you, Dr. Pfaff, for that introduction, and thank you, Dr. Wells and Dr. Hamilton, for the invitation to be here. And Dr. Hamilton, you said you cast the net broadly to get different perspectives, and a West Coast Lutheran pastor is probably about as far as you can get. I know. So I am a bit of an anomaly. It's not my full-time job to think about defense issues, let alone the moral implications of AI or lethal autonomous weapons. And I've only been working on the complexities of these issues for a little over a year. And today my name tag says pastor, but I've been privileged to wear the uniform of our country for well over 2 decades, both as a combatant and a non-combatant. And I've been studying theology and, by extension, anthropology and ethics for more than 15 years. But if you're wondering what a chaplain was doing at the Army War College and thinking about lethal autonomous weapons or laws, I can't recall how many times I was asked that question. My standard response is to quote Elihu Root, the Secretary of War who established the Army War College, and not to promote war, but to preserve peace. The questions that we've been considering relate to our ability to preserve peace through strength in a morally responsible manner. That debate is unquestionably important as it forces consideration of fundamental issues related to human society and warfare. When or if, and if so, how is it appropriate to take a human life? These questions are more important to AI and war than any dystopian fears of runaway machine learning technology that might threaten the human race. To paraphrase St. Thomas Aquinas, the common good transcends material interests. And he suggested that the very end of the military calling demands that our technical skills be ordained to a good higher than simply victory. And now it's slightly out of context, and he was citing another philosopher, but Stanley Hauerwas, former professor of theological ethics at Duke University, sir. He noted that the dominant form violence takes in modernity is speed. And now Stanley Hauerwas, if you know anything about him, he's a pacifist, born and raised in Texas, who said he wished he didn't have to be a pacifist. I'm not a pacifist. I can't be, even if I wish I could. Autonomous weapons create tension for us, we who would serve honorably and virtuously in the profession of arms. Artificial intelligence will not only enable the national defense establishment in a myriad of support and efficiency applications, it will undoubtedly work its way to the tip of the spear. And so it leads us to reflect critically on where we derive our moral strength, our identity, and our existential meaning, both individually and collectively. So I'll attempt to describe the tensions that are inherent in strategy formulation, specifically with regards to lethal applications, using a triple constraint construct: ethics, technological development, and strategy coherence. The rapid development of AI technology and its application to the conduct of war, both in autonomous weapons and enabling systems, creates a delicate balance between advancing technological development and ethical principles in strategy formulation. But it's a healthy tension between ethics, weapons, development, and strategy, because this tension creates the space for men and women to act responsibly in a field where the stakes are very high, because even one life has, from various perspectives, inestimable worth. Consider debates over capital punishment. It's worthwhile to consider the propriety of laws ever before a life is ever in the crosshairs, regardless of who or what is behind the optics. Early in the Cold War, then Chief of Staff of the Army, General Omar Bradley, feared that, quote, our knowledge of science has clearly outstripped our capacity to control it, unquote. Are we there yet? I don't believe so. And as Thomas Schelling has suggested, now nearly 75 years without nuclear war demonstrates that some measure of stability is possible. But I do believe that the United States is at an inflection point in the world regarding AI and laws that's analogous to the advent of nuclear weapons prior to 1945. Because before the decision was ever made to employ them, we committed to develop nuclear weapons even as serious moral and ethical concerns lingered. What would these weapons do if and when they were unleashed? Today, just as then, strategic leaders face decisions that are both thrilling and terrifying in their potential impact. Just as nuclear weapons still generate moral concerns in their development, modernization, procurement, and strategy, there is serious debate over the development and employment of laws. And I focus on the lethal applications, even though there are implications for non-lethal weapons and their effects as well. In order to contribute to the conversation over the propriety of AI applications and laws in particular, each of us has to have a firm grasp on the source of our moral strength individually and our collective strength as a nation so that we can act with confidence and courage in our vocations. And we have to consider if or when the ethical principles that guide policy might or might not change that policy. Many, however, see the moral underpinnings of the military profession as timeless. Now, when I was a second lieutenant studying studying and training on the art and science of minefield emplacement, I didn't reflect on the morality of the systems that I was employing. And I only reflected very briefly on the morality of war in general. In retrospect, I was confronted by the immense destructive power that was placed in the hands of a group of 18 to 25-year-olds. Trusting that our political and military leaders created the space for us to do our jobs honorably. And now as a chaplain and a Seelsorger, that's the German word for pastor, that means literally one who cares for souls, I have a great deal of sympathy for our warriors and our emerging military leaders. While I personally do not believe that machines threaten what it means to be human, even if they pose a very real threat to human flourishing, I think transhumanism and soldier enhancement is another question entirely. When we reflect on what war is, the nature of war, and the changing character of it, my aim isn't to introduce doubt, but to instill courage and build resiliency in an increasingly complex vocation. Because if war is, to quote Joint Publication 1, socially sanctioned violence to achieve a political purpose, or to quote Clausewitz, war is an extension of policy by other means, part of the dissonance that laws introduces is a result of the socio-political aspect of human interaction in war. Because war is a breakdown in the relationship between states and groups of people, even non-state actors, that has become violent. And real people die, usually both friend and foe. Political decisions, whether or not to wage war, place blood and treasure at risk. A just cause to go to war, right conduct in war, and care for the men and women in the profession of arms requires a great deal of empathy, and even empathy for our enemies as we consider our conduct and what our weapons and the means that we employ do to our adversaries. The law of armed conflict reflects greatly on the effects of what we do and how that affects real people, even our enemies. So it is a good question when we ask how far should a human be removed from the decisive act of taking a life. Currently, the Department of Defense does not authorize the use of laws against human targets. And the DoD specifies that autonomous and semi-autonomous weapons systems have to remain under human control. Given our present capabilities for autonomous systems and the need for those who employ them to trust the systems that they use, both commanders and operators, humans remain in the loop. Yet some of the concepts being discussed only very loosely keep a human on the loop. The rapidly evolving threat with respect to AI and laws, however, will force the U.S. to reconsider these policies, possibly fully before we trust the machines or risk lives and mission success in the face of overmatch. But pragmatic arguments like that can, and I would say should, leave us unsettled. People are naturally and appropriately uncomfortable killing other people, even for justifiable reasons. Izumi Nakamitsu, then the Undersecretary General for the High Representative for Disarmament Affairs at the United Nations, the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons, asserted that laws, quote, pose ethical and moral quandaries. Are we comfortable with outsourcing life and death decisions to machines? And what does that say about the value we place on the sanctity of human life? Unquote. What does it mean to be human? And do lethal autonomous weapons threaten that? Without delving too far into my approach to the question, there is concern that it, quote, crosses a moral threshold if we allow machines to independently target and kill humans, not simply because those machines are not yet trustworthy enough to unleash on the battlefield. So the triple constraint triangle describes the decision space for strategy formulation with respect to these weapons. Triple constraint, also known as the iron triangle of painful trade-offs, comes from the project management triangle of scope, time, and cost. An actor can't optimize any of the three without trade-offs. And so these factors compete for priority, creating an unresolvable tension. That is, you can't achieve the optimum value for all three constraints, and there are limits. Privileging one or two at the expense of the others assumes risk. So proposed Lethal autonomous weapons system triple constraint includes three factors: the technological advancement, strategy coherence, or the ends, ways, and means with an understanding of risk, and ethics, what is right behavior. Strategic decision makers operate in this space defined by the limits of morality and ethics, with available and emerging technology and strategy that's formulated by those same decision makers to achieve specified goals. Now, this is not new. Military leaders have wrestled with the use of various types of weapons and their employment throughout history, from the crossbow to aerial bombardment, even snipers and flamethrowers, which came up this morning. Landmines and other weapons have caused moral reflection in their own right. Consider again nuclear weapons, which the United States developed while addressing the significant moral concerns that they raised in view of the present threat, and ultimately decided to employ them, a decision that's still the subject of debate. But as Bernard and Fawn Brody observed in their classic book, From Crossbow to H-Bomb, the objections of some have never slowed the development of increasingly lethal weapons of war. The Department of Defense agency that's responsible for developing new capabilities and technologies, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, or DARPA, notes that the nation is best served if we push critical frontiers ahead of our adversaries. Hence the important work that the Defense Innovation Board has done to develop principles for the use of AI by the DoD. That assumption that we need to develop principles for their moral and ethical use is an acceptance of this triple constraint between the technological development and the strategy coherence. So I believe that existing ethical principles and accepted legal restrictions of the just prosecution of war are sufficient to guide morally responsible conduct regarding lethal autonomous weapons systems. Therefore, the capability to responsibly and ethically develop and procure laws should not be categorically restricted. At the same time, I'm grateful for dissenting voices that stimulate critical reflection on the distance and direction of the technological development of weapons systems that are enhanced and enabled by artificial intelligence. In like manner, it will be important to continue to involve leaders and thinkers from various disciplines, both inside and outside the national security establishment. And we must always endeavor to train military leaders who can think critically and creatively about complex problems for which there are no good answers. And even if fully autonomous learning machines are not currently capable of effective battlefield employment, and current capabilities and governing policies do not permit the employment of lethal autonomous weapons, strategic leaders in the national security establishment must consider their eventual development in use in order to continue to take morally responsible actions in the present. This iron triangle helps leaders understand the ethical tensions and associated trade-offs as the technology continues to rapidly evolve and our national security strategy is reassessed. Meanwhile, the study of history, philosophy, and religion to complement training in the art and science of warfare will form adaptable and ethical leaders of sound moral character for a rapidly changing security environment. For, to quote the ancient King Solomon, there is nothing new under the sun, even if timeless challenges are new to us in our generation. There may come a day when the acceptable and ethically sound choice would be to employ lethal autonomous weapons. Much more could be discussed and studied with regards to the concepts of nuclear deterrence, escalation, and stalemate. And it was Thomas Schelling who pointed out that the words terror and deterrence have the same Latin root. The last time that Sir Winston Churchill spoke to the British Parliament, early in the 1950s, he said, "It may well be that we shall, by a process of sublime irony, reach a stage in this story where safety will be the sturdy child of terror, and survival the twin brother of annihilation," unquote. All that being said, I am a military chaplain and civilian clergy, and I trade in the currency of hope. I have an abundant supply of temporal and ultimate hope, and it's not merely a naive optimism. My understanding of the way that the world is and the way that the world ought to be look forward to a brighter future. And so today, as I stand here, I'm grateful for all of you at the various stages of your public service. And there are centuries of public service in this room and centuries of public service to come. You all, and especially our cadets, give me hope. So my prayer for you is that you continue to train, to grow, and to learn, and to serve, and to teach, coach, and mentor America's sons and daughters today and tomorrow, that you are empowered and to do your vocations and to live faithfully in them confidently. Thank you.
All right, can we? All right. So General Dunlap, in his presentation, correctly admonished us, I think, to be careful about talking about regulating something we don't understand. But what I want to talk about, I'm going to kind of widen the aperture here a little bit, because I'm not going to talk about AI directly. I want to talk about disruptive technologies in general. Particularly because it's not just about AI anymore. It's about a lot of different technologies and how they all come together to create the concerns that we have. And so I'm going to ask the question, how do we regulate something because we don't understand it? Who saw Boris Johnson's UN General Assembly speech last month or 2 months ago? It was great. In the speech, he warns of a dystopian future of digital authoritarianism, the practical elimination of privacy, and my favorite part, terrifying limbless chickens. Just a great name for a band. I'm claiming I'm going to learn to play an instrument so I can have that band. Among other possible horrors. He specifically highlighted artificial intelligence, human enhancement, and cyber technologies as the cause for concern to bring about possible dire and global consequences. And while his speech was kind of weird, I think he kind of captured sort of the concern about technological innovation and change. It is not just proceeding at a rapid pace, rather they're combining in ways that are difficult to control. And while such a loss of control can be unnerving, when it's applied to military technologies, it can be downright frightening. But the right answer isn't to walk away from it. As we've talked about several times in the conference, our adversaries are developing these technologies too. So to walk away represents its own kind of moral failure. But I want to take 3 examples here. I think everybody who's familiar with the Houthi use of the Houthis are rebels in Yemen, their use of unmanned aerial vehicles, not just to attack the Saudi oil refinery, but they've been hitting Saudi frigates and shipping for quite a while. It's also something that I don't think a lot of people know about is the Iranian government, the Iranian hackers created a massive power outage in Turkey, in Istanbul, putting 40 million people without power because Turkey was supportive of Saudi operations against the Houthis. The other thing, along the line of human enhancement, the ISIS and other jihadi groups have taken to use Captagon, which is a kind of amphetamine which suppresses fear, builds endurance, and allows them to punch well above their weight when fighting larger, more organized forces. So what I want to do is, and kind of moving in a way ahead on this, I'm going to talk a little bit about what disruptive technologies are, what's the problem with disruption, what makes it morally problematic, and then talk about a possible way ahead. But one thing that's important to realize about these technologies is that none of them are very new. None of them are very advanced. And a lot of them are available commercially in some form. Despite that fact, the targets of these attacks that I talked about were caught by surprise. Moreover, despite the fact these technologies have been around for a while, they, as we've talked about in the last several presentations, we don't really have a good defense for it. As Rudy Volti observes, technological change is often a subversive process that results in the modification or destruction of established social roles, relationships, and values. And that poses a number of problems for us. But let's talk about what disruptive technologies are. The key isn't, again, how advanced they are, but the attributes they bring. What is common to disruptive technologies is the novelty of the attributes they introduce and how useful those attributes are to at least a subset of the user community. To the extent they meet user requirements well enough and incorporate attributes other users find attractive, they can displace the older technology over time, even if they do not perform as well. And a good example of this, one of the early studies on disruptive technologies in the field of economics, a guy named Clayton M. Christensen talked about the hard drive industry. In the beginning, hard drives were big because they maximized speed and memory. But then somebody got the idea, I'm going to make a small one. But the small ones were slower and had less memory, but they were portable. With that attribute, the home computer market was born, because now we could have computers that we could move around, put on our desks, and so on. Within a few years of that innovation, all the companies that were still making the big hard drives and not making the small ones were out of business. That's how disruptive technologies work. But then the question you have to ask, so what, right? What's the ethical problem with that? The fact that hard drive companies went out of business doesn't pose a moral problem. So how do we get there? Well, whatever your commitments, ethical commitments are, your codes are, ethical analysis has a certain kind of logic. It begins with the possibility of moral behavior, which requires morally autonomous agents. When these agents act, they should consider how their acts affect others, how it conforms to moral principle, and because ethics is other regarding, I would highlight justice and fairness as principles that they should consider. And also consider how they set conditions for promoting moral behavior and good character, which includes accounting for physical and mental well-being, not just of the individual, but the society they live in as well. So it's not hard to see, based on the conversations we've had this week, these last couple of days, how these technologies raise those kind of concerns. Moral autonomy, we've already talked about the concern regarding accountability and the accountability gap that they can raise. And the problem I'd highlight here is in conventional technology, or what was the term yesterday, cognitized technology? In non-cognitized technology, when something goes wrong, in principle at least, I can attribute that fault to the operator, the manufacturer, the designer, to some human, and either through bad intent or negligence. But the problem with AI is that you can have the harms arise even when everybody is doing a job well done. And that introduces the accountability gap, since there may be moral harm to which no one can assign moral fault. Human enhancements also lead to a similar concern. So imagine an enhancement, particularly in military context. So imagine an enhancement that improves lethality and survivability for the soldier, but comes with long-term side effects. Depending on how much lethality and survivability one gets out of it, and depending on the severity and probability of the side effects, you could be in a situation where you're forcing the soldier to choose between short-term survival and long-term pain, which is kind of like giving someone an offer they can't refuse, which is kind of coercive. As an example, the Germans in World War II provided their soldiers and airmen with a drug called Pervitin, which is a kind of crystal meth. And they were very transparent to their soldiers about the side effects. They even tried to regulate the doses so that they wouldn't, to minimize the chances of those side effects. But there's a great quote from a German bomber pilot who said, "Why do I care about the side effects of Pervitin when the Brits are going to shoot me down any minute?" So he continued to take it. What was the outcome? Well, one good vignette is on the Eastern Front, a unit of well-trained SS troops ended up surrendering to Russian conscripts because they had been on meth so long and they were so jittery. They had fired all their ammunition at the response to little noises in the night. And so when they finally encountered Russian forces, or Russian forces encountered them, they had no more ammunition left. Yeah. Now, regarding justice, treating others morally doesn't depend on how our actions affect them, but on what we owe them as persons. Now, I kind of go back to Kant when I want to fill out, the philosopher Immanuel Kant, when I want to fill out what that means. But all I'm really asking here is that we just kind of commit to the idea that we owe something to other persons, and we'll call that respect. And we can talk about what that means, but following the philosopher John Rawls, from the perspective of public policy, what that means is acting justly by fairly distributing social goods. Now, Rawls has a long list of what those goods are, but I think in the military context, we are primarily talking about risk and reward, both the soldiers and civilians. And here's where we can raise some concerns about justice. We've kind of already talked about the fact that any technology that distances soldiers from the violence they do or decreases harm to civilians lowers the political risks associated with using that technology. And as someone said earlier, that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it can become a bad thing if it incentivizes disregarding more costly but nonviolent alternatives, which could put you possibly violating the jus ad bellum condition of last resort. As Christian Enemark argues, political leaders having less cause to contemplate the prospects of death, injuries, and grieving families might accordingly feel less anxious about using force to solve political problems. Now, regarding well-being, this takes into account not only the physical safety and health of the individuals affected, but also mental health and quality of life concerns. And human enhancements aren't the only technologies that raise those kind of concerns. A lot of risk-reducing technologies have been associated with both desensitization and trauma on the part of operators. For example, a 2017 study confirmed a number of mental trauma, including moral disengagement, as well as intensified feelings of guilt resulting from riskless killing by UAV operators. Making the matter more complex, a 2019 study of British UAV operators suggested that the real culprit was environmental factors associated with employing the technology, such as work hours and shift patterns, were more important to the experience of mental injury than the traumatic events associated with the strikes they did. Now, regarding social disruption, we can break that down into two components. One is the civ-mil relationship. As these technologies reduce risk, the distribution of how the society views military service will change. And again, that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it is something to be prepared for. It also, it could alter how society rewards military service and also who serves. I think we're all familiar with Cyber Command. Is already reconsidering what standards for recruiting it needs to have, and has already offered direct commissioning to certain STEM majors, something previously reserved for the medical, legal, and religious fields. The second concern is, the transfer of technology or its effect to civil society. And that's not always a bad thing. Missile technologies for military use, for example, paved the way for space exploration. But not all transfers of military innovation are as helpful. We talked about earlier, yesterday we had a presentation where they raised the concern of human enhancements for military purposes making their way into civil society, whether because of soldiers returning to civilian roles or the technology itself moves in. But we've already seen that happen before. In World War I, the British mixed cocaine with rum to encourage the soldier, to make it easier to go over the top. Other armies also used cocaine to improve endurance and suppress fear. What happened was, at the end of World War I, you had a massive cocaine epidemic all over Europe because of addicted soldiers returning home, which caused a lot of disruption to those particular societies. And even when beneficial, there's a downside, or there can be a downside to military research, because sometimes it distorts research priorities and directs technology development in a way that reduces efficiency of civilian applications. For example, the U.S. Navy's dominant role in the development of nuclear reactors led to design choices that were less efficient and came with greater risks than alternative designs. for at least for civilian purposes. So to the extent the effects of these technologies have the kinds of impacts on the conditions I just described, I think then you have to ask, is it permissible to proceed with developing these technologies? Now I get it, and we've already talked about the development of these technologies is probably inevitable. But you still have to ask the ethical question about how do we go about doing it so we can align that development better with our moral commitments. And so I'm going to suggest 3 conditions. Moral effect, necessity, and proportionality need to be considered. Moral effect just really refers to the potential that employing a technology has for conforming to or violating moral norms. There are, of course, already rules in place to govern this. International law prohibits the development and acquisition of new technologies that cause unnecessary suffering, are indiscriminate in nature, or cause widespread, long-term, and severe damage to the environment, or modify the environment in a way that its effects would be otherwise prohibited. But international law only gets us halfway there, because it by design, covers our obligations to others, our external obligations to the enemy or adversaries or others in general. It doesn't say what our obligations are to our own soldiers and citizens. And here again, I'll invoke respect for persons, which says that complying with this imperative means the government and military commanders should avoid deceptive and coercive policies when it comes to acquiring these new technologies. Having said that, respecting someone as an ends does not always entail taking into account individual preference. By taking on their particular role, soldiers have agreed to take on certain risks. So what that tells us is that taking on these new technologies is going to require us to reconsider what kinds of things soldiers do legitimately consent for by agreeing to serve. Regarding necessity, Albert Einstein reportedly said, "I made one great mistake in my life when I signed the letter to President Roosevelt recommending that atom bombs be made. But there was some justification, the danger that the Germans would make them." What I think is interesting about this statement is that Einstein conditions his support for developing the atomic bomb not on the fact it provides a military advantage, not because it would hasten the end of the war, perhaps save lives, but because failure to have one would put the Allies at a disadvantage. And I think that's a good condition to consider here when you're developing disruptive technologies. That it's not enough just to seek an advantage; you have to avoid a disadvantage, because that's what will based on the risks that these things pose. And then regarding proportionality, let me do it on time. I have 5 minutes. Here I'm talking about proportionality relative to the disruption these technologies can cause. Here it's, proportionality is just a utilitarian constraint to do more harm than good. And those simple and formal can be difficult in practice. To do so, one first needs to determine what goods and harms count as relevant, and then determine how they weigh against each other. In the context of national security, necessity specifies deterrence and failing that victory as goods, and by implication, aggression and defeat as harms. The pursuit of deterrence and victory specify additional goods and harms, which includes human lives and the environment. And the analysis that we've done today, I would also suggest, economy, justice, well-being, and social stability are also goods. It's not meant to be exhaustive, but it provides us a starting point for moving ahead and analyzing whether or not something is proportional or not. But even with this framework in mind, such comparisons are hardly straightforward. Michael Walzer makes the point that proportionality turns out to be a hard criterion to apply, for there's no ready way to establish an independent or stable view of the values against which the destruction of war is to be measured. So even in conventional situations, it's not always clear how many non-combatant lives are worth any particular military objective. In the context of disruptive technologies, it's even less clear how much increased military effectiveness or deterrence is worth how much injustice or social disruption. And these really aren't questions anyone can really answer. Fortunately, one doesn't have to. if one conceives of proportionality as a limit on action rather than a permission, then really what matters isn't what's proportionate, but rather what's disproportionate. For example, it would be disproportionate to threaten divorce over an argument about what to have for dinner. And I can say that without having to commit what would be proportionate reasons for getting a divorce. It works the same way, I think, in military context. And nor does it mean in marginal cases is assessment impossible. Go back to the Iranian hackers creating the power outage in Turkey for 41 million Turks. Since the Turkish government's criticism did not have a similar effect on Iranian civilians and civil life, I would think arguably intentionally imposing that massive blackout would count as disproportionate, even if there were no equally effective alternatives to the Iranians. Of course, when doing proportionality in the context of disruptive technologies, it's not enough to account for intended as well as unintended but foreseen consequences. Disruptive technologies require us to take into account unforeseen and unintended consequences as well. Now, I know that sounds silly. How can you take into account unforeseen consequences since they're obviously unforeseen? But given that ought implies can, I think one cannot be morally faulted for a failure of the imagination. But what one can be faulted for is not taking into account that one's imagination may fail and not all the disruptive effects considered. And what that point, I think, suggests is that proportionality requires that actors consider how to manage the proliferation and evolution of the technology in advance of, as they are developing it, not because they have an idea of what the effects will be, but because they don't. One may not know how these technologies will affect autonomy, justice, well-being, and social stability, but the fact they could also suggests we should identify further measures for to shape their development. And I will conclude with some suggested measures. I won't read them to you, but basically summarized, I talk about things like prioritizing consent, thinking about the consequences and concerns at the outset of the development, paying attention to the distribution of reward and risk, managing the transfer and proliferation of the technology at the outset, design those technologies with that kind of concern in mind, and assess the way ahead in terms of the alternatives you have to developing that technology. And I think that puts us in a better position to handle the policy problems that we've talked about today and yesterday that these technologies will produce. And on that cheerful note, we're done. 30 seconds to spare.
Yes, I was wondering, since we're talking about ethics with AI, when it comes to any sort of autonomous system, whether released at cyberspace, battlefield, or wherever else, I'd like to hear your thoughts on the ethics of like a kill switch, if you will. The ability to disable, destroy any AI that we put out there, whether that's to deny enemy use or prevent misuse or perhaps the system malfunctions.
It's yours.
So no, I think that's, as Dr. Pfaff just talked about, being able to deal with potential bad effects, even if that's unforeseen and unintended. Something like a kill switch gives you that ability, and so I think that's a good thing to pursue with any type of weapons technology. The ability to bring it back once it's unleashed, and really that's the fundamental problem with the treaties that we've signed on anti-personnel landmines, because there is no ability to pull that back if you just leave it and forget about it. So I agree. I think that's important to consider with any development.
Well, a couple things. One, the mines do have a battery in it, and when the battery runs out, then it self-deactivates. But the kill switch, isn't the problem with the kill switch is it might be compromised to the enemy? And for you, Tony, I see that you have, you mentioned efforts to ban technologies. Isn't the problem with doing that is that you can only capture the technology in a snapshot of time? And so other later developments, may change what that calculation was, but you're still stuck with the ban. For example, with blinding lasers, you can incinerate somebody lawfully, but you can't design a weapon intended just to blind them. And if you look at the ICRC site, they say, in essence, they say, well, it's better to be dead than blind. That's in essence what they say. And that is hard to morally justify. But now we have technologies that can, and maybe, enable people to see. I think you get the point
Yeah,
that
no.
I'm concerned with about especially disruptive technologies, and rather than emphasizing the basic law and applying it across the board to everything, trying to pick out a technology and try and ban it, I think is problematic.
Yeah, so no, that's a great point. And actually, one of the things I didn't get into because of just time is what that's really about is when are we morally permitted to develop something that would be on the face evil in itself, like Mallet and say. And the answer should be never, right? Well, except I agree with you, not always. And the example, I think, the precedent that I think is really interesting. In 1864, the Russians developed soft shells that were designed to be used against logistics wagons and supply trains. The Russian Minister of War correctly discerned that, if they're used against people, they're soft, they explode, and they cause a lot of unnecessary suffering. So rather than developing and fielding these weapons, they gathered everybody in 1868 in St. Petersburg, not everybody, 19 states, in St. Petersburg, and got them to agree to a ban on these weapons, or on these systems, and limiting the size and caliber of the soft shells that would be fielded under the principle of not committing unnecessary suffering. So I thought that was an interesting precedent and suggests that, sometimes you might actually, because the bad guys are going to do it, because the effects you just described, you might have permissions to develop otherwise prohibited technologies. But my point there is you have to you have to develop it with getting the ban in mind, the way the Russian, I know the Russians kind of came across that a little accidentally, but you have to develop it with getting the ban in mind and building a consensus on restricting their use. It won't be perfect, but then you have it available for a deterrent. I mean, chemical weapons is another good example. We didn't use chemical weapons in World War II. And the Germans, despite the fact that they lost, didn't use chemical weapons in World War II. One of the reasons I think people understand the case is that there were two large ships sitting in a port in France filled with chemical weapons for hours, and we let them know, if you use them, we have plenty and we'll use them back. And so they never got used. So we talked earlier about reciprocity. Well, this is how you kind of set the stage for it. So again, the point here is just sometimes there are permissions. I think you do have permissions to continue to develop these kinds of technologies, even though they're otherwise prohibited. But you have, I think these conditions have to apply when you do that.
I have two questions. The first is, we've talked about introducing a lot of wide-ranging AI solutions. Being the former director of training and doctrine for the infantry for 4 years, the real expense comes in how do I train it? How do I sustain it? How do I take that technology and make it work in the field on a consistent performance basis? That's the first challenge. So if I build a TOW missile, I can't fire that every day. I got to build a training system that goes with it. It's almost more expensive in the beginning because I've got to put it, but I can use it over and over again. So that's part one. This is kind of back to the general's question that he had earlier. Increasingly, we are fighting as advisors to other countries. So we get into this ethics things. Having spent a long time fighting with Montagnards, both as mercenaries and then in transition, they have a whole set of codes and ethics and mores that religious, including religious, that are so different to understand. You have to be really careful in how you really work with that. And I think increasingly, since we've moved to these brigades without soldiers that are going to go in and support training and help armies, this whole thing of ethics is going to become proportionally more challenging. Not that we didn't make good decisions, we did, and we stopped a lot of things from happening, but we had to explain why we were doing it. So your thoughts on those?
No, it's a great question. It came up, I think, in an earlier panel. But I would say two things to that. One is in looking at cross-culturally at ethics, I find that, it's not, while they may seem different, what really is the difference, and General Dunlap's example earlier today kind of showed that, is who it applies to more than what the differences are. We tend to have, every society has rules for showing each other respect, and fairness and kindness and all those kind of things that we might consider ethical behavior. But they don't always extend to people not in that society. So that's one thing I look for. And then even when you don't have that, or you have just very difference in ethics, if we're the ones providing the weapons, it's our ethics that matter, because we have to go back to the American people and say, we did this. And again, we're not asking for for the other society to fully accept our way of life and all of our ethical norms. In fact, we're really not asking them to accept much more than what's in international law. Discrimination, proportionality, and not committing unnecessary suffering. I think the way to proceed is just be very clear what you're, what ethical commitments you're requiring them to make. And then if they're not willing to make that, then you probably, you either have to reconsider how you're supporting them or reconsider whether you're supporting them.
And the question related to training devices and how are we going to address that? Because that's as equally challenging with some of these things that you want to put out there.
You want to try that?
Well, I think we build that into any weapons development, don't we? Because to use a TOW missile example, we wouldn't field a system like that until we could trust the system. And a big part of that is not just training the operators or the soldiers that would employ those systems, but making sure that the equipment, the machine itself, is reliable and trustworthy and performs. And that's what, with the Defense Innovation Board and the principles that they've worked to establish, and even the DoD directive from 2012-13, that we want to use systems that are predictable and behave the way that we want them to.
I'm just making the point.
Yes, sir.
It's very much a part of how we feel any solution to go with.
Well, no, and I would agree. I mean, it's certainly required that you have, and you have to have that kind of stuff in place before, as you field it. So you can get, I was a TOW missile platoon leader once, and, and we had the simulators, and, and if we didn't, our missiles would have missed more often than they did.
Isn't the unique problem with AI, especially AI learning machines, is that the device is different each time you use it? In other words, it has different characteristics based on what it's learned. And that's why I think DoD is focusing, as you saw on the ethics, on narrow AI. In other words, where it can only learn up to a certain point. Eventually, we'll be facing adversaries that have a more generous assessment. But I think that another aspect of that is what they call explainable AI, AI that will tell you how it got to its conclusion, because it may be doing things in coming to those conclusions that don't fit with what you actually wanted to do.
I mean, I would agree. In fact, in another article I wrote, I talk about explainability being a moral requirement, not just a smart. It's also practical and ethical, precisely because of the kind of error it can introduce. And by way of example, a very simple decision support system. And that's the other thing with AI. We're not just talking about targeting systems. We're talking about decision support systems as well. If you've got a logistics system that gets the ammunition to the wrong place, people are going to die. You may not be violating international law, but you're getting your people killed, and that's equally bad. And in Iraq, they had a decision support system that picked convoy routes and told you to avoid the ones where there was a lot of enemy activity and go on the ones where there wasn't. The one day, the route generators put out a particular route. The convoy went on it, and they got annihilated. Massive attack, lots of casualties. What happened was, because no one was going on that route, there was no data regarding of attacks on that route. So over time, it became the machine thought it was the best route. This is a simple example, and our human operators didn't even didn't know to check that output of the machine. That challenge is just going to get harder as we go along for all the reasons you just said. these machines change, every iteration. So I think that's a real problem.
Okay. I think that brings us to the
So the Sergeant Major has not been whispering in my ear. But here's the question. I want to bring this back down to the ground because we've had a great philosophical discussion. But the focus of the conference is on pre-commissioned education and preparing young lieutenants for the battlefield. Here's my concern. From my earliest days, 2 priorities: mission first, people always. If you give me a tool, I'm going to use it. Okay? So how do we prepare these young people to deal with these ethical situations? And you can't give them a long philosophical answer. You've got to embed it in their training. You've got to select the right people to be those lieutenants. I'm just not sure, but I'd like your opinion, particularly because I think you're a rucksack chaplain.
Try to be, yes, sir. So, well,
And Tony is absolutely distinguished in terms of thinking through this stuff.
I have an answer, but go ahead.
Yes, sir. Well, and I think we've touched on some of those things earlier with Mr. Brooking's presentation just a few minutes ago. He talked about not just giving people a list of ethical principles, but putting them in situations where they have to reason through those types of scenarios, and not just putting a tool in their hands and saying, have at it. And I recall a friend in Baghdad in 2004 who was a company commander who dismounted his 50 cals from his gun trucks because he knew the collateral damage in the area that he operated every day would be too great. So giving our cadets and emerging leaders situations where they think through that, and then giving them the ethical and moral tools by philosophical, religious education, history, keeping those historical examples and vignettes, and like our colleagues from West Point highlighted yesterday when they read through Washington's Crossing and they worked those scenarios into other aspects of their curriculum. Those types of things are important. Not just giving them a tool and saying here's how you use it, but talking about when and why.
It's a great question. My first response is, if you don't want a philosophical conversation, you probably shouldn't hire a philosopher because we just can't help ourselves. It's inevitable, just like AI. But here would be my response. In taking care of them, I've got 2 audiences. My first audience is guys like you, because I want you to be able, through your experience, to understand the ethical concerns that we're talking about, how they all fit together, and then integrate it into the training they receive. I want you guys to hear this because I want you thinking about this right now. I'm not asking you to look at this as a checklist, but these are things that you should raise. And ultimately, ethics is more about the reasons we give and take for justifying the behavior that we have. And you better get good at that. And you're going to have to start doing that now because you're not always going to have a clear-cut answer. And as I think you said, you got to be able, when you're talking to your troops, you got to give them the why. You got to give them the reasons. And if you have ethical, and since a lot of what you're going to be dealing with are ethical challenges, you better get good at giving those reasons in a compelling and justified way.
And I will say there's a great parallel between the crossbow and AI.
Oh, yeah. Well, and what's interesting about the crossbow is, we're talking about disruption being morally pragmatic. Actually, it helped with the evolution of just war theory, because before, warfare was governed by chivalry, which was chivalric kinds of codes, which was much more about personal honor than the kind of humanitarian concerns that motivated the just war tradition over time. So that's why disruption is not necessarily something to fear, but it is something to manage.
Okay, we're at the end of our symposium here, and there's 3 things that we want to do to wrap things up. First, I'm going to invite Dr. Pfaff to come up and, as a representative of the Strategic Studies Institute at the Army War College, our partner in this symposium, to sort of wrap things up. Secondly, is we're going to have our final book drawing, And then third, we want to recognize some folks who supported technological support and other support for our symposium here. So, Dr. Pfaff, it's all yours.
Well, the good news, in a lot of ways, I've kind of already given my concluding remarks because I've done my best already to kind of summarize what I think we got out of it and kind of engage the material that we've talked about before. But what I hope everybody got out of this conference, and you guys in particular, is a good understanding about what AI is, the kinds of things it can do, and especially the legal and ethical and, as you pointed out, sort of the practical challenges with employing it in a effective but just manner. Because that's going to be important to all of us in here, whatever role you play in the future. But I would be remiss if I didn't conclude with thanking the wonderful folks here at the University of North Georgia for hosting another great conference where they were able to bring together, perhaps with one notable exception, some outstanding speakers who really, I think, engaged us all in thought-provoking conversations and gave us really a lot lose sleep over tonight. So I just would like a round of applause for the University of North Georgia folks for putting on a great conference. I wish everybody safe travels back to wherever you're going to go. And if it's up to me, we're done.